Hey guys, tonight the sun over Belgravia was not a gift, it was a golden cage. It poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling mansion, illuminating every speck of dust that dared to dance in the stagnant air. Inside the master dressing room, the heat was suffocating, smelling of lavender water, stale starch, and the metallic tang of suppressed rage. Clara Sterling stood atop a velvet pedestal, her arms raised like a marble statue. Behind her, a sturdy maid tugged at the silken laces of a swan-neck corset. "Tighter, Martha," Clara whispered, her voice like cracking ice. "I need to feel as though I cannot breathe. It is the only way to endure the afternoon tea." "But Miss Clara," the maid gasped, bracing her knee against the small of Clara's back. "Your ribs, they're already bruised from Tuesday's ball." "The bruises are hidden by the silk, Martha. Society, however, sees every inch of a loose waistline. Pull." With a sharp grunt, the laces hissed. Clara's breath left her in a sudden, sharp puff. Her waist was reduced to a mere 18 inches, a fragile bridge between her billowing petticoats and her stiffened bodice. To any observer, she was the pinnacle of Victorian grace, a porcelain doll polished to a high shine, but beneath the ribs, her heart hammered against the whalebone stays like a trapped bird. Across the room, Alice, the younger sister by 2 years, sat on a chaise longue. She was supposedly reading a book of poetry, but her eyes were fixed on the grandfather clock in the corner. Its rhythmic tick, tick, tick felt like a countdown to a detonation. "You're quiet today, Alice," Clara remarked, her voice strained by the constriction of her lungs. Alice didn't look up. "I am merely contemplating the irony of our existence, sister. We spend 3 hours dressing in clothes that prevent us from moving, so that we may sit for 4 hours in rooms where we are not allowed to speak our minds." "A dangerous thought," Clara replied, catching Alice's eye in the tall mahogany mirror. "Keep it tucked away, along with the others." The room grew quiet, save for the rustle of heavy fabric. The Sterling sisters were the crown jewels of their Aunt Mildred's social ambitions. Since their father's mysterious passing a year ago, they had been molded into the ultimate trophies. Their skin was kept pale, their opinions were kept silent, and their lives were kept under a microscope. But as the maid moved away to fetch the morning gowns, the atmosphere shifted. The dolls became human. Alice stood up, her movements fluid and hurried. She approached the window, looking down at the street where a black carriage waited. To the neighbors, it was just another day in the wealthy enclave. To Alice, it was a reminder of the world beyond the gates, the world of soot, shadow, and the secrets they had begun to harvest. "The post arrived early," Alice whispered, her back to the door. "He delivered it to the service entrance, hidden in the crate of winter apples." Clara's posture didn't break, but her eyes sharpened. "And did the ink match?" "Precisely," Alice said, her hand disappearing into the folds of her lace-trimmed underskirt. She pulled out a small, rectangular slip of paper. It was vellum, yellowed at the edges, and covered in a series of nonsensical numbers and Latin phrases. To a common thief or a prying aunt, it was gibberish. To the Sterling sisters, it was a map. "The East End is restless," Alice continued, her voice dropping to a low hum. "The inspector is asking questions about the blue thistle. He thinks the apothecary is a front for Irish radicals." Clara let out a cold, dry laugh. "Let him think that. As long as he doesn't realize it's being funded by the daughters of a dead aristocrat, we are safe. Is the meeting set for tonight?" "Midnight near the docks," Alice replied. Suddenly, the heavy brass handle of the dressing room door turned. In a flash of practiced elegance, Alice tucked the letter back into the hidden pocket of her petticoat. Clara instantly resumed her vacant, pleasant expression. Aunt Mildred marched in, her silk skirts swishing like a warning. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper judgments. She walked around Clara, inspecting her like a piece of livestock at a fair. "You look adequate," Mildred declared, tapping Clara's corset with a lace fan. "But your eyes look tired. Use the belladonna drops before the guests arrive. We cannot have you looking haggard when the New York investor arrives." "Of course, Aunt," Clara said, her voice a perfect imitation of a submissive niece. "And Alice," Mildred turned, her gaze narrowing, "stop clutching that book. It makes you look intellectual. Men do not marry intellect, they marry temperament. Try to look more vacant." "I shall strive for total emptiness, Aunt," Alice said with a mock bow. Mildred nodded, satisfied, and swept out of the room. The door clicked shut. The silence that followed was heavy. The sun had moved, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor, shadows that looked like bars. Alice walked over to the vanity table. She picked up a silver hairbrush, but her fingers were trembling. The letter in her pocket felt like a branding iron against her skin. It wasn't just a letter, it was the key to their father's ledger, the ledger that proved their family's wealth was built on the misery of the very people they now secretly tried to save. "Clara," Alice whispered, "if we are caught tonight, if the inspector follows the carriage." Clara stepped down from the pedestal. She walked over and placed a firm hand on Alice's shoulder. Despite the corset, despite the stifling heat, her grip was like iron. "We are the Sterling sisters, Alice. To the world, we are fragile glass, but glass can be sharpened into a blade." Clara took a silk bodice from the chair, a masterpiece of embroidery and lace. She held it out for Alice. "Put it on, hide the letter, and when we walk down those stairs, remember, smile until your face aches. Silence is our greatest weapon." Alice took the bodice. With practiced, steady hands, she slid the coded letter deep into the lining of the silk, right against her heart. She pulled the laces tight, feeling the paper crinkle. It was a secret heartbeat, a hidden truth buried under layers of Victorian lies. The porcelain facade was complete. They were ready for tea, they were ready for the world, and they were ready for the dark. The afternoon dragged on with the agonizing slowness of a funeral procession. The drawing room was filled with the clinking of fine bone china and the vapid chatter of the London elite. Clara sat by the window, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap like two resting lilies. She nodded when the wives of barons spoke of their gardeners. She smiled when the young lords boasted of their hunting dogs. But inside, she was calculating. She watched the shadows on the sundial in the garden. Each inch the shadow moved was an inch closer to the docks. Each chime of the clock was a signal. Beside her, Alice was playing the part of the vacant niece to perfection. She stared out at nothing, her eyes glassy and wide. Aunt Mildred leaned over to a guest and whispered, "Alice is such a peaceful girl, no troublesome thoughts in that head of hers." Clara suppressed a smirk. If Mildred knew that peaceful, Alice had spent the previous night studying the chemical composition of arsenic and its effects on the human nervous system, the older woman would likely have a stroke on the Persian rug. Finally, the guests began to depart. The sun dipped below the horizon, staining the London sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The gas lamps in the street began to flicker to life. "I am going to my chambers," Clara announced as the last carriage pulled away. "I have a sudden migraine." "And I shall attend to her," Alice added quickly. "She needs her cooling salts and a dark room." Mildred waved them away, her mind already on the next day's guest list. "Very well, but be ready early tomorrow. Mr. Vane from New York will not wait for two sickly girls." The sisters climbed the grand staircase, their heavy skirts thumping softly against the carpet. As soon as they reached the landing, their pace changed. The lethargy vanished. In the sanctuary of Clara's bedroom, the transformation began. The silk gowns were discarded on the floor, left like the shed skins of snakes. Out came the dark trousers, the heavy wool coats, and the thick boots they kept hidden behind the false back of the wardrobe. Alice reached into her discarded silk bodice and pulled out the coded letter. Her fingers were no longer trembling. The porcelain facade had been shattered, and in its place was something much more dangerous. "Check your satchel, Alice," Clara commanded, pulling a dark cap over her golden hair. "Do you have the vials?" "6 of the sedative, 3 of the restorative," Alice replied. Checking the leather pouches at her waist, "And the letter, it's safe." Clara looked at her sister. In the dim candlelight, they didn't look like the Sterling sisters anymore. They looked like ghosts of the East End. "Then let us go," Clara said, opening the service door that led to the back stairs. "London is waiting." Corsets and constraints. The dining room of the Sterling mansion was a masterclass in gilded oppression. A massive chandelier of Bohemian crystal hung from the ceiling like a frozen explosion, casting a harsh, unforgiving light upon the silver cutlery and the expectant faces of the guests. Tonight, the air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, expensive sherry, and the suffocating perfume of Aunt Mildred's social desperation. Clara sat at the far end of the table, a position that offered her a panoramic view of her own captivity. Her dress was a deep midnight blue, a color that Aunt Mildred claimed brought out the innocence in her eyes. But inside, Clara felt anything but innocent. The corset she had donned earlier was now a screaming reminder of her status. With every breath, the whalebone dug into her ribs, a physical manifestation of the social laws that dictated how much space a woman was allowed to occupy in the world. To her right sat Lord Harrington, a man whose neck was as thick as a bull's and whose mind was twice as narrow. He leaned over, his breath smelling of aged port and entitlement. "I tell you, Mildred," Harrington boomed, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "The problem with the modern age is that we have become too soft. I heard a rumor today that a woman was seen at the university library, actually requesting a text on political economy. Preposterous. A woman's mind is like a delicate watch. If you overwind it with complex thoughts, the gears simply snap." Aunt Mildred let out a tittering, obedient laugh. "Oh, Lord Harrington, you always have such a way with metaphors. It is true, a woman's true economy is her household. Is that not right, Clara?" Clara felt the heat rise in her throat. Her internal monologue screamed, "I have read every book in my father's secret library, you bumbling ox. I have balanced ledgers that would make your head spin." But her public face remained as still as a frozen lake. "Indeed, Aunt," Clara replied, her voice a soft, melodic trill. "We find the weight of a heavy book quite taxing for our fragile wrists. I much prefer the weight of a teaspoon." Beside her she felt Alice stiffen. Alice was younger, and her temper was a flicker of flame that was harder to douse. Alice was currently being entertained by a young curate who was explaining the spiritual necessity of feminine submission. "And tell me, Miss Alice," the curate whispered, leaning uncomfortably close, "do you not find comfort in the quiet life, in the knowledge that the heavy lifting of the world, the politics, the finance, the grit of the street, is handled by the stronger sex?" Alice looked at him. For a split second, the vacant look Aunt Mildred had demanded slipped. Her eyes flashed with a cold, predatory intelligence. "I find, Mr. Gable, that heavy lifting is a matter of perspective. Managing a household of 20 servants while maintaining the social reputation of a dynasty is quite a feat of engineering, wouldn't you say?" The table went silent for a heartbeat. Aunt Mildred's fork clattered against her plate. "Alice is merely joking," Mildred intervened, her voice sharp as a razor. "She has a whimsical sense of humor, quite charming in small doses." The conversation shifted back to the safety of the London season, but the tension remained. For the sisters, this wasn't just a dinner, it was a battlefield. Every sexist remark from Harrington, every dismissive nod from the curate, was a coal added to the fire of their resentment. They see the silk, Clara thought, watching a drop of wine glint on the rim of her glass. They see the lace and the ribbons. They do not see the ink on our fingers. They do not know that while they discuss the delicacy of our minds, we are planning to dismantle the very corruption that keeps them wealthy. The dinner moved into the third course. The heat in the room was rising, the gas lamps hissing like serpents. Lord Harrington began a long-winded story about a strike at the docks, the very docks the sisters planned to visit at midnight. "The rabble are demanding better pay," Harrington sneered, waving a greasy finger. "They don't understand that the empire requires sacrifice. My associates and I have had to be firm. A few nights in the cells usually clears their heads. It's the only language they speak." Clara felt a sharp kick under the table. It was Alice. Alice's eyes were fixed on Harrington's waistcoat pocket. There, hanging by a gold chain, was a fob watch. But it wasn't the watch Alice was looking at. It was the small silver key attached to the chain, the key to the warehouse at Pier 14. Their father's ledger had mentioned that key. It opened the Black Room, where the records of the Duke's illegal opium trade were kept. The plan shifted instantly. They hadn't expected Harrington to be here tonight. This was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. "Lord Harrington," Clara said, her voice suddenly bright and flirtatious, "you speak so passionately about the docks. It sounds quite heroic. I must confess, I have always been fascinated by the firmness required to lead men. Perhaps you could show me that watch. I've heard it was a gift from the prince himself." Harrington puffed out his chest, his vanity overriding his caution. "A keen eye, Miss Clara. Most girls only notice the jewels on a lady's neck. Yes, it is a fine piece of machinery." He leaned toward her, unhooking the chain from his vest. This was the moment of the sterling shuffle. While Clara distracted him with a barrage of vapid questions about the watch's mechanism, Alice purposely tripped while reaching for the salt. The salt cellar tumbled, spilling across the table. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" Alice cried out, standing up and creating a flurry of movement. Aunt Mildred sighed in exasperation. The curate jumped to help. In the chaos of the spilled salt and the rising guests, Clara's hand moved with the speed of a pickpocket. Her fingers brushed the silver key. She didn't take it, that would be too obvious. Instead, she pressed a small piece of soft wax, hidden in her palm, against the key's teeth. Click, the impression was made. She pulled her hand back, tucking the wax into the folds of her midnight blue skirt, just as Harrington sat back down. "Everything all right?" Harrington asked, looking confused by the sudden commotion. "Perfectly, my lord," Clara smiled, her face the picture of Victorian innocence. "Just a bit of spilled salt. They say it's bad luck, unless you throw a pinch over your shoulder." "Nonsense," Harrington laughed. "Luck is for the weak. I make my own destiny." "So do we," Clara thought, feeling the cold lump of wax against her thigh. As the dinner finally wound down, the guests moved to the drawing room for coffee. The sisters were expected to perform a duet on the piano. As they sat on the bench, shoulder to shoulder, their fingers danced across the ivory keys in a perfect harmony of Mozart. But as they played, they spoke in whispers, their words masked by the crescendo of the music. "Did you get it?" Alice whispered, her fingers hitting a sharp C. "The impression is perfect," Clara replied, a low trill of notes. "We'll need to cast it before midnight." "Aunt Mildred is watching us," Alice warned, her eyes focused on the music sheet. "She knows something is off." "Let her watch," Clara whispered, the music becoming louder, more triumphant. "By the time she realizes the dolls have left the house, we'll be halfway to the East End." The final chord of the piano piece rang out, vibrating through the room. The guests applauded politely. Lord Harrington leaned back, sipping his coffee, entirely unaware that his destiny had just been copied into a piece of wax. Aunt Mildred walked over, her eyes cold as she looked at her nieces. "Well played, girls. Now, go to your rooms. You both look flushed. I won't have you appearing feverish for tomorrow's engagements." "We are quite tired, Aunt," Clara said, bowing her head. "The excitement of such brilliant conversation has exhausted us." They walked up the stairs, the heavy oak steps creaking under their weight. They didn't look back. Behind them, the mansion felt like a tomb of silk and silver, but as they closed the door to Clara's bedroom, the air changed. The constraints were about to be cast aside. The corsets were still tight, but the fire in their hearts was hotter. "Get the lead and the crucible, Alice," Clara said, her voice no longer a trill but a command. "We have a key to make and a kingdom to burn." The midnight carriage. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hall struck 12. Each chime vibrating through the floorboards like the heavy footfalls of a ghost. At number 12 Belgrave Square, the silence was absolute, an artificial, manicured silence that masked the secrets breathing within its walls. In the master bedroom, Clara Sterling stood perfectly still. She waited, her ears straining for the sound of Aunt Mildred's heavy, rhythmic snoring from across the hall. Finally, the signal came, a soft, triple tap on the connecting wall from Alice's room. The transformation began. Clara reached for the back of her dress, her fingers flying over the silk-covered buttons that had felt like silver nails only hours before. She stepped out of the midnight blue gown, leaving it in a heap on the carpet like the discarded skin of a snake. Next came the corset. As the laces loosened, Clara took her first real breath of the night. It was a sharp, jagged gasp, her lungs expanding into the newfound space with a sensation that was both painful and glorious. "No more porcelain," she whispered to the shadows. She pulled on a pair of thick woolen trousers, stolen months ago from a stable boy's laundry line. Over them went a heavy, charcoal-grey coat and a tattered cap. In the dim moonlight, the refined Miss Sterling had vanished, replaced by a lean, boyish figure that moved with predatory grace. She met Alice in the narrow servants' corridor. Alice was dressed similarly, her golden hair tucked tightly under a newsboy's cap. In her hand, she carried a leather satchel that clinked softly, the sound of glass vials and the newly cast silver key. "The main doors are bolted," Alice whispered, her eyes wide with the adrenaline of the hunt. "And the cook is still awake in the scullery, finishing the silver." "The laundry coal chute," Clara replied, her voice a low, commanding hum. "It leads directly to the side alley. It is narrow, it is filthy, but it is the only way out without a key to the heavy iron gates." They moved like smoke through the darkened house. They passed the portraits of their ancestors, men with cold eyes and women with forced smiles. Clara felt a surge of triumph. She was the first Sterling woman in 3 generations to walk these halls as a master of her own movement. The coal chute was a black maw in the basement wall. The smell of soot and damp earth rose from it, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented rooms upstairs. "I'll go first," Clara said. She slid into the narrow opening. The world became a claustrophobic tunnel of cold metal and grime. She slid down, the soot coating her wool coat, until her boots hit the wet cobblestones of the alleyway with a muffled thud. A moment later, Alice tumbled out beside her, coughing quietly into her sleeve. "Welcome to the real London," Clara murmured, brushing the black dust from Alice's shoulder. At the end of the alley, beneath the flickering yellow glow of a dying gas lamp, a black carriage waited. It was not the polished, crested brougham of the Sterling family. This was a night hack, a battered, anonymous vehicle with mud-caked wheels and a horse that looked as tired as the city itself. The driver, a man named Sealers with a scarred cheek and a silent tongue, nodded as they approached. He had been bribed with enough silver to keep him quiet for a lifetime. "The East End, Sealers," Clara commanded, stepping into the cramped, hay-smelling interior. "And drive as if the devil is chasing us, but the police are not." The carriage lurched forward, and the journey began. The transition was a descent into an urban purgatory. As they left the West End, the world began to change. The wide, clean boulevards of Belgravia, where the houses stood like silent white giants, gave way to the narrower streets of the city. Here, the gas lamps were fewer, their lights struggling to penetrate the thick, yellow London particular fog that rolled off the Thames. "Look," Alice whispered, pulling back the tattered leather curtain. They were crossing into the shadow of St. Paul. The air was no longer sweet. It was thick with the smell of coal smoke, horse manure, and the salty, rotting tang of the river. The grand architecture began to crumble into leaning tenements and boarded-up storefronts. The clean London of tea parties and piano duets was a lie. This was the truth. The fog grew denser, swirling around the carriage like a living thing. They passed men huddled over braziers of glowing coals, their faces etched with the exhaustion of the unwanted. They passed women in thin shawls, standing under the eaves of gin palaces with eyes that had seen too much and hoped for too little. "This is where Father's money came from," Clara said, her voice bitter. "Every lace doily on Aunt Mildred's table was paid for by the sweat of this fog. He didn't just trade goods, Alice, he traded lives." Alice gripped her satchel tighter. "And that is why we are here, to take back the debt." The carriage jolted violently as the wheels hit a deep rut in the mud. They were deep in the East End now, the labyrinth of Whitecapel. The streets here did not follow a grid. They twisted and turned like the intestines of a beast. The noise changed, too. The polite silence of the West was replaced by a cacophony of distant shouting, the clatter of iron-shod wheels on broken stone, and the low, mournful whistle of the steamships at the docks. Suddenly, Sealers pulled the horses to a sharp halt. The carriage rocked on its springs. "Pier 14 is just ahead, miss," Sealers called out, his voice muffled by the fog. "I can't go no further. The watchmen are out, and a carriage like this draws eyes in the dark." Clara opened the door. The air hit her like a physical blow, cold, damp, and smelling of iron and old fish. They stepped out into a world where the only light came from the dull red glow of the dockside lanterns. "Wait for us at the corner of Flower and Dean Street," Clara instructed, pressing another silver coin into the driver's hand. "If we are not back by 3, drive away. Do not come looking for us." Sealers didn't answer. He simply tipped his hat and vanished into the fog, the sound of the horses' hooves fading into a rhythmic ghost beat. The sisters stood alone in the heart of the labyrinth. Behind them was the world of satin. Before them was the world of steel. "The key, Alice," Clara whispered, her eyes searching the gloom for the silhouette of the warehouse. Alice reached into her bag and pulled out the silver key they had cast from Harrington's wax impression. It felt cold, a jagged piece of destiny. "Tonight," Alice said, her voice steady despite the shivering cold, "we stop being the dolls. Tonight, we become the surgeons." They moved toward the docks, two shadows blending into a city of a million secrets. The fog swallowed them whole, erasing the Sterling sisters from existence and leaving only the Shadow sisters in their wake. The East End Shadow. The transition from the carriage to the cobblestones of Whiteacre was like stepping through a mirror into a nightmare. Here, the air was a thick, greasy soup of coal smoke and the rotting stench of the Thames. The fog didn't just drift, it clung to the skin like a damp shroud. Clara and Alice pulled their caps lower, their expensive leather boots now caked in the black, oily mud of the East End. "Keep your head down," Clara whispered, her voice losing its melodic trill and taking on the sharp, clipped edge of the streets. "In this light, we are just two more ghosts in a city of shadows." They turned into a narrow alleyway where the brick walls seemed to lean inward, as if trying to crush the life out of anyone brave enough to pass. At the very end of this claustrophobic lane stood a door, a heavy oak slab with a small iron-barred window. There was no sign, there was no gold lettering, only a small, faded blue thistle painted crudely on the doorframe. Clara knocked, 3 slow beats followed by 2 quick taps. A slide clicked open. A pair of tired, suspicious eyes peered through the iron bars. Recognition was instant. The heavy bolts groaned as they were pulled back, and the door swung open to reveal a world that Aunt Mildred would never believe existed. "The benefactors," a voice rasped. The man at the door was old Sealers, not the driver, but a former surgeon whose hands had grown too shaky for the theatre, but remained steady enough for the apothecary. The room was filled with the low hum of bubbling glass retorts and the pungent, earthy smell of valerian root and eucalyptus. Inside the blue thistle, the Sterling sisters were no longer ornaments. Clara stepped into the center of the room and shed her heavy coat, revealing the lean, efficient movements of a woman born to lead. Alice headed straight for the back table, where rows of small blue vials waited to be filled. "How many tonight, Sealers?" Clara asked, her eyes scanning the ledger on the counter. "Too many, miss," Sealers sighed, rubbing his weary eyes. "The fever is spreading in the tenements near the tannery." The hospital turned them away because they couldn't pay the entry fee. "If not for the tinctures you brought last week, half of those children would be in the ground by now." Alice pulled a glass bottle from her satchel. "I've refined the willowbark extract. It's stronger now, it will break the fever faster. But we must be careful. The authorities are cracking down on unlicensed chemists." "Let them crack down," Clara said, her jaw tightening. "They call this forbidden medicine because they cannot tax it. They call it a crime because it keeps the poor alive enough to demand their rights." For the next 4 hours, the sisters lived their true lives. There was no tea to pour, no piano to play. Clara managed the distribution, her mind working like a high-speed engine as she organized the couriers, young boys who knew the city's secret tunnels better than the police. She handed out coins and medicine, her voice firm yet compassionate. Alice, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of scientific precision. She moved between the shelves, mixing compounds with a speed that came from years of secret study in the Sterling attic. She was no longer the vacant girl Aunt Mildred poked with a fan. She was a chemist, a healer, a woman of power. Suddenly, a frantic pounding echoed through the door. Old Sealers moved to the window. "It's young Tommy," he whispered, unbolting the door. A boy of no more than 10 scrambled in, his face pale with terror. "The watchmen, they're coming down from Commercial Road. They've got dogs, and they're searching every cellar for the Shadow Sisters." The room went cold. Clara didn't panic. She turned to Alice, their eyes meeting in a silent communication that had been forged since childhood. "Sealers, hide the ledgers in the floorboards," Clara commanded. "Alice, pack the concentrated extracts. We leave through the roof." "But the couriers," Alice started. "They know the alleys better than we do. They'll vanish," Clara said, grabbing her coat. "We are the targets. If they find the Sterling sisters in an East End apothecary, our lives are over. Not just our secret, our lives." They climbed a rickety wooden ladder to a trapdoor in the ceiling. The air on the roof was freezing, the wind whipping Alice's cap and threatening to reveal her golden hair. Below them, they could hear the distant baying of hounds and the heavy rhythmic thud of police boots on the cobbles. "This way," Clara whispered, leaping across a narrow gap between two tenements with a bravery that would have made Lord Harrington faint. They moved across the rooftops of White Capel like two dark angels. Below them, the East End was waking up to the hunt. They saw the flickering torches of the watchmen, heard the screams of neighbors being dragged from their beds. "Why are they hunting us so hard tonight?" Alice gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "Because the pamphlets we printed last week touched the Duke," Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hint of grey light was beginning to bleed into the sky. "We didn't just give medicine, Alice. We gave the people a voice, and the Crown hates nothing more than a voice it cannot silence." They reached the end of the block. A drainpipe led down into a small courtyard behind a deserted bakery. Clara slid down first, her hands burning against the cold iron. Alice followed, landing softly in the shadows. Just as they reached the street, a lantern light swung around the corner. "Halt, who goes there?" a voice boomed. It was an inspector, not a common watchman, but a man in a tailored coat with a silver badge that caught the moonlight. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he looked at the two boys standing in the mud. Clara stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't run, she didn't hide. She used the only weapon she had left. "Please, sir," she said, her voice suddenly high-pitched, trembling and thick with a fake Cockney accent. "Me brother and me, we're just looking for a bit of coal for me mother. She's took real sick, she has." The inspector walked closer, his boots clicking on the stone. He held the lantern up to Clara's face. For a terrifying second, the light illuminated the fine line of her jaw and the porcelain clarity of her skin, features that no coal worker's daughter could ever possess. Alice held her breath, her hand gripping a vial of sedative in her pocket. If he moved to arrest them, she would strike. The inspector stared at Clara for what felt like an eternity. He looked at her eyes, eyes that held a fierce, unyielding intelligence. Then, he looked at the mud on her boots and the soot on her coat. "Get out of here," the inspector muttered, lowering the lantern. "The dogs are out tonight. If they catch you, I can't help you. Go home, boy." Clara didn't wait for a second invitation. She grabbed Alice's hand and they vanished into the fog. They didn't stop running until they reached the corner of Flower and Dean Street, where Sealers and the battered carriage were waiting. They scrambled inside, the leather seats feeling like a luxury they no longer deserved. As the carriage began the long journey back to the West End, the sun began to rise. The golden light hit the white mansions of Belgravia, making them look like monuments to a dead age. Alice slumped against the seat, her face streaked with soot. "We almost lost everything tonight, Clara." Clara looked out the window at the approaching gates of their home. "No, Alice, tonight we learned the most important lesson of all." "What's that?" "The inspector knew," Clara whispered. "He saw my face, and he let us go. We have an ally in the dark, and in this war that is more valuable than all the gold in father's ledger. They reached the side alley of number 12 Belgrave Square. The laundry coal chute waited for them, a black hole leading back to their lives of silk and silence. They climbed back in, shed their woolen clothes, and scrubbed the east end from their skin with freezing water. By the time Aunt Mildred knocked on the door for morning prayers, the Sterling sisters were back on their pedestals. Their hair was perfectly coiffed, their skin was pale, and their eyes were vacant. The East End was a shadow. The apothecary was a dream. But as Alice sat in the drawing room, she felt the weight of the new vials she had hidden in the piano, a reminder that the benefactors would return. A ledger of secrets. The dust in their late father's private study did not float. It hung suspended in the air like the microscopic remnants of 1,000 lies. It had been exactly 1 year since Richard Sterling was found dead at his desk, his heart supposedly failing him in the middle of a business transaction. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a man of God, gold, and impeccable British virtue. To his daughters, he was becoming a ghost they no longer recognized. "Aunt Mildred is at her prayer circle," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the mahogany long-case clock. "The servants are occupied with the silver polishing. We have perhaps 1 hour, Clara." Clara stood in the center of the room. The study had been preserved like a shrine, smelling of old tobacco, expensive leather, and the heavy, sweet scent of rot that lingers in unventilated places. She walked toward the massive oak desk, the altar where their father had sacrificed his life for the Sterling name. "He didn't leave us wealth, Alice," Clara said, her fingers tracing the edge of a silver inkwell. "He left us a cage. This house, the dresses, the expectations, it is all a debt we are still paying, but the money has to be somewhere. The accounts don't settle." They began their search. They weren't looking for jewelry or loose coins. They were looking for the iron box, a legend whispered by their father's frantic solicitors in the weeks following the funeral. Alice knelt by the fireplace, tapping the hearthstones with the heel of her boot. "He was a man of patterns, Clara. He always looked at the portrait of Mother when he spoke of the family fortune, not with love, but with a strange, calculating guilt." Clara turned to the oil painting above the mantel. Their mother, pale, beautiful, and long dead, stared back with eyes that seemed to follow them. Clara reached up, her fingers searching the heavy, gilded frame. A small, spring-loaded latch gave way. The portrait swung outward on silent hinges, revealing a cavity carved into the stone chimney. Inside sat a box. It was not gold. It was made of cold, black iron, pitted with age and secured with a lock that required the silver key they had copied from Lord Harrington's vest. "The key, Alice," Clara breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Alice handed her the silver replica. Clara inserted it into the lock. It turned with a heavy, visceral clunk, the sound of a tomb opening. They expected gold sovereigns. They expected deeds to tea plantations or shipping manifests. Instead, the box contained a single, thick book bound in vellum that felt uncomfortably like human skin. Clara opened the first page. Her eyes scanned the elegant, copperplate handwriting of their father. As she read, the color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the porcelain dolls they pretended to be. "This isn't a business ledger, Alice," Clara's voice was a ragged whisper. "This is a map of the abyss." They sat on the floor, the forbidden book spread between them. The entries were not for cotton or silk, they were for human souls. October 12th, Lord Penhaligon, £3,000 for the suppression of the Dover scandal. The girl has been moved to the colonies. November 4th, the Bishop of London, payment received for the silencing of the shipyard strike, funds diverted from the orphans' relief. January 19th, Lord Harrington, opium shipments cleared through Pier 14, customs bypassed via the Sterling seal. Alice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He wasn't a merchant, he was a blackmailer, a broker of sins. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Every luxury they had ever known, the silk ribbons in their hair, the fine French wine, the very education that allowed them to read these words, had been paid for with the blood and misery of others. Their father hadn't built an empire, He had built a parasitic web that lived off the secrets of the powerful. "Look at the last entry," Clara commanded, her finger trembling as she pointed to the bottom of the final page. The ink was fresher here, dated only days before their father's death. March 1st, the American venture. Julian Vane arrives in April. He carries the papers for the New York expansion. If he discovers the source of the sterling seed money, the hangman's noose will be the only inheritance left for my daughters. He was terrified, Alice whispered. The American, Julian Vane, he isn't here to partner with us, Clara. He's here to collect a debt, or to expose the rot. Clara slammed the book shut. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. He didn't die of a heart attack, Alice. He was silenced. He had become a liability to the very men he was blackmailing. The sisters sat in the growing shadows, the iron box between them. The porcelain facade they had maintained all morning felt like it was shattering, falling away in jagged pieces. They were no longer just two sisters playing at being rebels in the East End. They were the daughters of a monster, and they were now the keepers of a book that could burn London to the ground. "If the Duke finds out we have this," Alice started. "He will kill us," Clara finished, "and if the inspector finds out, we will hang. We are trapped between the gallows and the blade." But as Clara looked at the black iron box, a new light appeared in her eyes. It wasn't the light of fear, it was the cold, calculating fire of a sterling. "We won't burn it," Clara said, her voice regaining its iron strength, "and we won't hide it." "Then what?" "We use it," Clara whispered. "Our father used this book to enslave people. We will use it to set them free. Every name in this ledger is a man who thinks he owns us. Tonight, we show them that the Sterling sisters have stopped being the dolls and have become the puppeteers." Outside, a carriage pulled up to the front of the mansion. A loud, confident knock echoed through the house. "Mr. Julian Vane has arrived," a footman called from the hall. The sisters looked at each other. Alice tucked the ledger into the hidden lining of her cloak. Clara stood up, smoothing her skirts and wiping the soot from her cheek. "The American is here for his inheritance," Clara said, a dark smile touching her lips. "Let's go down and show him exactly what kind of women the Sterling name produces." They walked out of the study, leaving the ghost of their father behind. The secret was out. The war had truly begun. The masquerade at Vauxhall. Vauxhall Gardens was a riot of colour, chaos, and calculated sin. It was a place where the rigid hierarchy of London melted away beneath the glow of 10,000 paper lanterns. Here, a duchess could brush shoulders with a pickpocket, and a gentleman could lose his fortune or his soul in the shadows of the winding gravel paths. Clara and Alice Sterling moved through the entrance gates, their identities safely hidden behind the velvet and silk of their masks, to the world. They were merely two more wealthy revelers lost in the music, but beneath their costumes, their hearts beat with the cold precision of a ticking clock. Clara wore a mask of an exquisite crimson fox, the fur shimmering under the gaslight. Her dress was a daring shade of emerald silk, cinched so tight it felt like a second skin. Beside her, Alice wore the silver mask of a barn owl, wide, unblinking eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. "The ledger was specific, Alice," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the swelling crescendo of the orchestra. "Entry 42, the man with the sapphire ring. He meets his informants near the hermit's grotto at the stroke of 11. Alice scanned the crowd. "There are 1,000 men here, Clara. Half of them are wearing rings, and the other half are hiding their hands." "Look for the gate," Clara replied, her eyes sharp behind the fox mask. "The ledger said he walks with a slight limp in the left leg, a souvenir from a duel in his youth. A man who hides his face cannot hide his stride." They moved deeper into the gardens. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, roasting meats, and the heavy, expensive perfume of the aristocracy. Laughter echoed from the dark alcoves, some of it light-hearted, some of it cruel. Suddenly, Clara felt a hand on her arm. She didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her emerald silk rustling. Standing before her was a man in a black domino mask. He was tall, lean, and carried an air of effortless danger. On his right hand, a massive sapphire glinted like a fallen star. "A fox in a garden of owls," the man said, his voice a smooth, low baritone that vibrated in Clara's chest. "A dangerous choice, madam. Foxes are known for their cunning, but they are often hunted for their pelts." Clara felt a shiver of adrenaline. This was him, the informant mentioned in her father's secret ledger, the man known only as the Raven. "And ravens are known for feeding on the dead," Clara countered, her voice steady and flirtatious. "Tell me, do you find the pickings in Vauxhall to be profitable tonight?" The man laughed, a dry, rhythmic sound. He stepped closer, his presence crowding Clara's personal space. "Profits depend on the quality of the secrets one is willing to trade. Shall we dance? The waltz is a marvelous way to speak without being overheard." Clara glanced at Alice. With a subtle nod, Alice faded into the crowd, taking her position to watch for any sign of the Metropolitan Police or Aunt Mildred's spies. Clara took the Raven's hand. As they stepped onto the open-air dance floor, the world began to spin. The lanterns blurred into streaks of fire. The music, a haunting minor-key waltz, seemed to pull the breath from her lungs. "You dance with the grace of a woman who was born to the ballroom," the Raven whispered, his hand firm against the small of her back. "But your grip is that of a woman who knows how to hold a knife." Clara leaned in, her fox mask inches from his. "Perhaps I am both. London is a city of dualities, is it not?" "Indeed," he replied. "I once knew a man, a merchant of high standing, who dealt in silk by day and scandals by night. He had 2 daughters. One was a rose, the other was a thorn. I wonder, which one are you?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. He knew, or he suspected. She had to play the game. She had to lead him into the trap before he closed the jaws on her. "Roses and thorns grow on the same bush, sir," she said, her eyes locking onto his behind the masks. "But tell me, why would a man with a sapphire ring be so interested in a dead merchant's family? Is it because the ledger he left behind contains a name that keeps you awake at night?" The Raven's hand tightened on her waist, just a fraction, but it was enough to tell her she had struck a nerve. "The ledger is a dangerous toy, little fox," he hissed, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "There are men in this garden, men in high places, who would burn this entire city to ash just to see that book destroyed. If you have it, you are already a dead woman walking." "Then it is lucky that I am already a ghost," Clara replied, her voice cold as a winter grave. Suddenly, a commotion broke out near the entrance of the grotto. A woman's scream pierced the music. The waltz faltered. Clara saw Alice signaling frantically from the shadows. "The watchman!" Alice's voice reached her through the chaos. The Raven looked toward the gates, his grip on Clara loosened. "It seems our dance is interrupted. A pity. I was starting to enjoy the hunt." "The hunt has only just begun," Clara said, pulling a small wax-sealed envelope from her bodice and sliding it into his pocket. "Read that. It's a page from the ledger. If you want the rest, meet me at the East End Apothecary on Tuesday. Come alone or do not come at all." Without waiting for an answer, Clara spun away, disappearing into the swirling crowd of masks and silk. She found Alice near the hedgerow. "We have to go now," Alice gasped, grabbing Clara's hand. "The inspector is here. He's not looking for pickpockets. He's looking for the women in the masks." They ran. They didn't head for the main gates. Instead, they dove into the dark walk, a notorious, unlit path that led to the river. The sounds of the masquerade faded behind them, replaced by the heavy thud of their own boots and the distant whistle of the police. They reached the riverbank, where a small rowing boat waited in the reeds. They scrambled in, Clara taking the oars. As she pulled against the dark, oily water of the Thames, she looked back at the glowing lights of Vauxhall. The fox mask lay on the floor of the boat, its painted eyes staring up at the moon. "Did you get the information?" Alice asked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I did more than that," Clara said, her muscles aching with every stroke. "I set the bait. The Raven is hungry, Alice, and when a bird of prey gets hungry, it becomes careless." Alice looked at the dark water. We are playing a dangerous game, sister. Tonight, identities were blurred, but soon, the masks will have to come off, and I fear the world won't like what it sees underneath." Clara didn't answer. She only rode harder, moving deeper into the fog, leaving the masquerade and the sapphire ring behind. The porcelain facade was no longer just a disguise, it was a weapon, and tonight they had drawn blood. Sisters in silence. The fog over the Thames was no longer a veil, it was a hunter's net. Clara and Alice ran, their boots slipping on the slime-covered stones of the riverbank. Behind them, the rhythmic, metallic clatter of police whistles tore through the night air like a serrated blade. "This way," Clara hissed, grabbing Alice's arm and hauling her into a narrow crevice between two rotting timber warehouses. They collapsed into the darkness of a damp alleyway. The air here was stagnant, smelling of salt, rusted iron, and the overwhelming scent of wet stone. They pressed their backs against the cold brick, holding their breath until their lungs burned. The sound of heavy, hobnailed boots echoed at the mouth of the alley. A beam of light from a bullseye lantern swept across the entrance, illuminating the swirling mist, but missing the two shadows tucked deep into the grime. They went toward the bridge, a voice shouted, a rough, authoritative bark of a metropolitan sergeant. "Spread out, don't let them reach the tenements." The footsteps faded, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was a heavy, expectant silence. Alice slumped against the wall, her chest heaving. The silver owl mask was gone, lost somewhere in the frantic flight from Vauxhall. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat, her golden hair spilling out from under her cap like frayed silk. "We can't keep running like this, Clara," Alice whispered, her voice trembling with the onset of a panic she had suppressed all night. "The circle is closing. The inspector, he didn't just see us, he's hunting us. He knows we aren't just common thieves." Clara looked at her sister. In the faint, grey light filtering from the street lamp, she saw the terror in Alice's eyes. It was a reflection of her own soul. They were no longer the sterling diamonds. They were two fugitives in a city that hanged women for much less than what they had done. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the ledger, the heavy, vellum-bound book of their father's sins. It felt like a block of lead, a weight that was dragging them both toward the gallows. "Listen to me, Alice," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic growl. "Tonight changed everything. The Raven knows who we are, the police are at our heels. The double life is no longer a game, it is a war." She pulled a small, pearl-handled penknife from her boot. The blade glinted in the dark. Alice gasped, drawing back. "Clara, what are you doing?" "We need a pact, Alice, a pact that goes beyond sisterhood, beyond blood." Clara took Alice's hand, her grip like a vice. "If the law catches us, they will use one of us to break the other. They will offer a pardon to the sister who betrays the secret. They will try to turn our love into a weapon." Clara pressed the tip of the blade to her own thumb. A single, dark drop of blood welled up, looking black in the shadows. "I swear it now," Clara whispered, her eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying light. "If I am taken, you do not come for me, you do not speak my name. You take this ledger, you take the gold hidden in the scullery, and you burn every piece of evidence. You flee to America on the first ship. You leave me to the rope, and you save the truth." "No," Alice cried out, a muffled sob escaping her throat. "I won't leave you, I can't." "You must," Clara shook her, the movement sharp and violent. "If we both hang, the secrets die with us. The people in the East End, the children Sealers is treating, they lose their only hope. Swear it, Alice, swear it on the blood." Alice looked at the blade, then at her sister's face. She saw the resolve there, the cold, sterling iron that their father had possessed, but turned toward a higher purpose. Slowly, Alice reached out and took the knife. She made a matching cut on her own hand. They pressed their thumbs together, the blood mingling in the cold, damp air of the London night. "I swear," Alice whispered, her voice suddenly cold and steady, "if you are caught, I will burn the world to protect the secret. I will leave you behind, I will flee, and I will never look back." The blood oath was sealed. In that moment, they were no longer just sisters, they were a cell of two, they were a conspiracy of silence. Now, Clara said, tucking the knife away, we find Sealers and the carriage. We go back to Belgrave Square. We put on our silk dresses. We smile at Aunt Mildred, and we prepare for Julian Vane. They emerged from the alleyway like two ghosts. The police whistles were distant now, a mournful sound echoing over the water. They walked with their heads down, their movements synchronized, two women bound by a promise of betrayal for the sake of survival. As they reached the corner, Alice looked back at the dark alley. We just gave up our souls, didn't we? Clara didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, the long, treacherous road that led back to their porcelain lives. No, Alice, Clara replied, we just ensured that our souls belong to us and not to the hangman. They vanished into the fog, the silence between them louder than any whistle, a silence that would define the rest of their lives. The gentleman from New York. The morning after the blood oath did not bring peace. It brought Julian Vane. He arrived at number 12 Belgrave Square not with the hushed reverence of a London suitor, but with the loud, metallic confidence of the New World. The sun was barely over the chimney pots when his carriage, a sleek, modern vehicle of American design, pulled up to the curb. Inside the drawing room, Clara and Alice were already in position. They were the sterling diamonds once again. Clara sat at the embroidery hoop, her fingers moving with robotic precision. Alice sat by the window, a book of French poetry open on her lap. Their skin was powdered to a deathly paleness, their hair coiffed into rigid golden crowns. Remember, Clara whispered, her lips barely moving, he is not Lord Harrington, he is not a fool. He sees what he is looking for, so make sure he looks at the porcelain, not the crack. The door swung open. Aunt Mildred entered, her face flushed with the excitement of potential capital. Girls, may I present Mr. Julian Vane of New York. He was your father's final business prospect, and he has come a long way to settle the Sterling estate. Julian Vane stepped into the room. He was a man made of sharp angles and expensive wool. His face was tanned, a sign of a life lived outdoors, and his eyes were a startling, piercing blue that seemed to scan the room like a surveyor. He didn't bow as low as a Londoner. Instead, he stood tall, his hands tucked into his waistcoat pockets. Miss Sterling, Miss Alice, he said. His voice was a rich, American rasp, devoid of the filtered vowels of the British elite. It's a pleasure to finally see the faces behind the correspondence. He walked toward Alice first. He didn't look at her dress or her hair. He looked directly into her eyes. Alice held her gaze, her face a mask of serene, vacant beauty. I've heard much of your temperament, Miss Alice, Vane said, a slight, mocking smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Your aunt tells me you are the most peaceful creature in all of London. No troublesome thoughts, no opinions on the market, just poetry and prayer. I find that the world provides enough noise on its own, Mr. Vane, Alice replied, her voice a soft, practiced whisper. I have no wish to add to it. Vane leaned in, his shadow falling over her book. And yet you are reading Baudelaire. In the original French, most peaceful girls prefer the hymnal. Baudelaire writes of ghosts and shadows and the rot beneath the city. Strange choice for a porcelain doll, wouldn't you say? The room went cold. Aunt Mildred cleared her throat nervously. Clara's needle froze in the silk. He's hunting, Clara thought. He's not looking for a wife. He's looking for the ledger. Mr. Vane, Clara intervened, her voice drawing his attention away from her sister. You must forgive Alice. She chooses books based on the color of their binding, not the content of their pages. Tell us, how does New York compare to our humble London? I hear the buildings there are trying to touch the sky. Vane turned to Clara. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. New York is a city of glass and steel, Miss Sterling. It has no time for shadows. In New York, if a building is rotting, we tear it down. We don't hide the decay behind a coat of white paint and a title of nobility. He walked to the center of the room, his boots clicking with an aggressive rhythm on the hardwood floor. He stopped before the portrait of their father. Your father was a master of the long game, as we call it in the States, Vane said, his back to them. He talked of cotton and shipping, but his ledgers, they had a strange way of disappearing. I'm here to find those ledgers, because you see, The sterling fortune is currently sitting in a New York bank, and I cannot release it until the accounts are transparent. Clara stood up, her emerald silk rustling. The accounts were settled at the funeral, sir, our solicitors. Your solicitors are old men who like their tea with too much sugar, Vane interrupted, turning to face her. I don't want tea, I want the truth. There is a gap in the sterling history, a missing year, a missing set of names, and I have a feeling, a very strong feeling, that the answer is in this house. He stepped closer to Clara until she could smell the faint scent of tobacco and sea salt on his coat. You are very good, Miss Sterling. The posture, the smile, the perfect, empty gaze, it's a masterpiece, but I've spent my life looking at forgeries, and your public persona, it's too perfect. It's a wall, and I want to know what you're hiding behind it. Alice stood up, joining Clara's side. The sisters stood together, two statues of silk against a man of iron. If you find our presence too perfect, Mr. Vane, Alice said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a cold, steady blade. Perhaps it is because you are used to the rough edges of the colonies. In London, we value the facade. It is what keeps the city from falling into the mud. Vane laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that felt like an intrusion in the quiet room. There she is, the thorn behind the rose. I knew you were in there somewhere, Miss Alice. He picked up his hat from the table. I'll be staying at the Savoy. I'll be back tomorrow for tea, and the day after, and the day after that, until I find what I'm looking for. I suggest you check your porcelain for cracks, ladies, because the wind is blowing in from the Atlantic, and it's very cold. With a sharp nod, Julian Vane turned and marched out of the room. The silence he left behind was deafening. Aunt Mildred began to flutter about, talking about his charming American eccentricity, but the sisters didn't hear her. Clara looked at Alice. Alice's hand was gripping the Baudelaire book so hard the vellum was beginning to tear. He knows, Alice whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't come for the money, he came for the ledger. He came for more than that, Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the door where Julian Vane had vanished. He's a bloodhound, and we just gave him the scent. What do we do? Clara looked at her embroidery, a pattern of roses and thorns. She took the needle and plunged it into the center of a silk flower. We let him in, Clara said, her voice dark and determined. He wants to see the crack in the porcelain. Fine, we'll show him, but we'll make sure that when the wall falls, it falls on him. The intrusion was complete. The hunter had entered the garden. But as the Sterling sisters watched the carriage drive away, they knew one thing Julian Vane did not. In London, the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate a doll. Ink and scandal. The night air was thick with the scent of rain and wet soot, but inside the hidden cellar of a derelict bookstore in Fleet Street, the air smelled of something much more dangerous, printer's ink. Clara Sterling stood over the heavy iron frame of a salvaged printing press. Her lace gloves had been replaced by stained leather, and her emerald silk dress was hidden beneath a rough canvas apron. Beside her, Alice was meticulously setting the type, her fingers moving with the speed of a pianist. Each small lead letter clicked into place, a tiny soldier in an army of words. The headline, Clara? Alice asked, her voice barely a whisper against the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the metal. The Vultures of Vauxhall, Clara replied, her eyes burning with a cold, revolutionary fire. Subtitle it, A Record of Sins Bought with Sterling Gold. This was their greatest subversion. For weeks, they had been the silent observers of the London elite. They had sat through dinners with Lord Harrington and tea with Julian Vane, absorbing every boast, every slip of the tongue, and every cruel laugh. Now, they were turning those words into a weapon. The ledger was open on a nearby crate. Clara flipped through the pages, her finger landing on an entry regarding the illegal closure of the East End hospitals. Let it be known that while the Duke of Marlborough toasts to his new stables, 300 families in Spitalfields have been cast into the street to make room for his horses. The money was not earned, it was stolen from the pockets of the dead. Alice's fingers flew. If we publish this, the Metropolitan Police will tear the city apart to find the press. Let them, Clara said, her voice echoing in the damp cellar. "They are looking for radicals in the slums. They are looking for men with dirty hands and loud voices. They will never suspect that the most dangerous pamphlets in London are being printed by the perfect diamonds of Belgravia." The first sheet was fed into the press. Clara grabbed the heavy iron lever, a task that required every ounce of her strength. She pulled. The machine groaned, a sound of grinding gears and shifting weight. It was the sound of the old world being crushed by the new. Thump! Clara pulled the sheet away. The ink was wet, black, and beautiful. The words stood out against the cheap paper like a scream in a silent room. "The vultures of Vauxhall." "It's perfect," Alice breathed, her eyes reflecting the dim candlelight. "By dawn, 3,000 of these will be in the hands of the street sweepers, the newsboys, and the carriage drivers. By noon, they will be on the desks of the very men we've named." They worked through the night in a feverish silence. The physical labor was exhausting, a brutal contrast to the delicate life of embroidery and piano playing they led by day. Their muscles ached, their hands were stained with permanent black ink, and their lungs burned from the fumes of the oil lamps, but for the first time, they felt truly alive. "Julian Vane is watching the house," Alice said, as she bundled the first 100 pamphlets. "He saw the mud on our shoes yesterday. He's not going to stop until he finds where we go at night." "Julian Vane thinks he is the hunter," Clara said, wiping a smudge of ink from her forehead. "He thinks he can buy the sterling secrets with his American dollars. He doesn't realize that some secrets aren't for sale, they are for justice." Suddenly, a soft whistle echoed down the ventilation shaft from the street above. It was the signal. "The watchman," Alice hissed, instantly dousing the main lamp. The cellar fell into a terrifying, heavy darkness. They stood perfectly still, the only sound the frantic beating of their own hearts. Above them, they could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the pavement. A beam of light from a lantern flickered through the cracks in the street-level grating, dancing across the ceiling of their hidden room like a ghostly finger. Clara gripped the handle of the press. She felt the weight of the ledger against her side. If they were caught here, there would be no trial. The scandal alone would destroy them, and the men they had exposed would make sure they never reached the gallows alive. The footsteps lingered. A voice drifted down through the grate, a low, gravelly mumble of two policemen sharing a flask. "Did you see that shadow near the bookstore, Higgins?" "Just a cat, Sergeant, or another one of those incrates the inspector is so worried about. Let's move on, the wind is biting tonight." The footsteps faded into the distance. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We have 20 minutes before the next patrol. Finish the bundles. We meet the couriers at the back of the alley." They moved with the efficiency of soldiers. By 4 in the morning, the press was wiped clean and hidden beneath a stack of dusty law tomes. The pamphlets, their ink and scandal, were gone, vanished into the bags of the young boys who would distribute them across the city. The sisters emerged from the bookstore, looking like two more tired laborers returning from a night shift. They walked through the early morning fog, their caps pulled low. As they reached the gates of Belgrave Square, the sun began to rise, a pale, sickly yellow through the London smog. On the doorstep of number 12, pinned to the door with a small silver dagger, was a single, wet pamphlet. "The Vultures of Vauxhall." Clara stared at it. Someone had already delivered one to their own house, and standing on the balcony above, looking down with a curious, terrifying smile, was Julian Vane. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and another pamphlet in the other. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his glass in a mock toast, his eyes locking onto Clara's. "The ink is still wet, Miss Sterling," he called down, his voice cutting through the morning air. "A very industrious night, I assume." Clara didn't flinch. She reached out, ripped the pamphlet from the door, and tucked it into her pocket. "The news travels fast in London, Mr. Vane," Clara replied, her voice a cool, steady blade. "I suggest you read it carefully. There is a section on foreign investors that you might find enlightening." She walked past him into the house, the weight of the ledger and the ink on her hands a badge of honor. The subversion had begun. The scandal was no longer a secret. It was a revolution printed in black and white. Chapter 10. The Gambling Den's Queen. The entrance to the Devil's Drop was nothing more than a rotting cellar door in a nameless alley off 7 Dials, but inside, it was a cathedral of vice. The air was a stagnant fog of expensive Turkish tobacco, spilled gin, and the electric, metallic scent of desperate men's sweat. Gas lamps hissed overhead, their yellow light flickering against the damp, brick walls like a dying pulse. Clara Sterling was gone. In her place stood Mr. Charles, a slight, ethereal young gentleman with a razor-sharp jawline and eyes that seemed to have seen far too much of the world. Her golden hair was tucked beneath a tall silk top hat, and a masterfully applied stage mustache concealed the delicate curve of her upper lip. Beside her, Alice stood in the shadows, dressed as a common street urchin, her hand never leaving the concealed pocket that held their getaway tools. "Steady, Alice," Clara whispered. Her voice dropped into a practiced, gravelly baritone. "If I blink, we lose. If I tremble, we hang." They moved toward the high-stakes table at the back of the den. This was the inner circle, where the laws of London did not apply. At the center of the table sat Baron Mordaunt, a man whose fortune was built on the misery of the docks, and whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his addiction to the card game Vingt-et-un. "A new bird has flown into the cage," the Baron sneered, his eyes scanning Clara with a predator's instinct. "Tell me, Mr. Charles, do you have the stomach for this table? We don't play for copper here, we play for blood and secrets." "I have no interest in your blood, Baron," Clara said, sliding a stack of gold sovereigns onto the felt table with a steady hand. "But I have a great deal of interest in your luck. Shall we deal?" The game began. The rhythmic snap-snap-snap of the cards against the table was the only sound in the room. Clara watched the Baron's eyes. She didn't look at his hands. She looked at the slight twitch of his jaw and the way he touched the sapphire ring on his finger whenever he had a winning hand. She was using her father's secret gambling notations, a language of numbers and probability that most men in the room couldn't even fathom. 4 of diamonds, king of spades. The deck is tilted, Clara thought, her mind working with the cold speed of a mechanical engine. He's hiding a card in his cuff. He's arrogant. He thinks a boy cannot beat a baron. The stakes rose. The pile of gold in the center grew until it represented more money than a common laborer would see in 10 lifetimes. But Clara didn't want the gold. Her eyes were fixed on a small silver key hanging from a chain on the Baron's vest, the key to a safe deposit box at the Bank of England, where the Duke's private correspondence was rumored to be held. "You're bold, boy," the Baron hissed, his face reddening as Clara won her 3rd consecutive hand. "I'll go all in, everything on the table, against that emerald ring you're wearing." "Not the ring, Baron," Clara replied, her voice a cool, dangerous silk. "Against that small silver key, a mere trinket for a man of your stature, surely." The Baron paused for a second. Suspicion flared in his eyes, but the lure of the emerald and the shame of losing to a youth blinded him. "Fine, the key against the ring, show your hand." Clara flipped her cards, a natural 21. The room went silent. The Baron's face turned from red to a deathly, bruised purple. He stared at the cards, his breath coming in ragged, wet heaves. "You cheated," he whispered, his hand moving toward the pistol hidden beneath the table. "No boy plays like that. No one beats Mordaunt." "Luck is a fickle mistress, Baron," Clara said, standing up slowly. "The key now." With a snarl of rage, the Baron ripped the chain from his vest and threw it onto the table. "Take it, but you won't leave this alley alive with it." He signaled to the 2 hulking brutes standing at the door. Alice saw them move first. "Clara, now!" Alice shouted. Clara grabbed the key and the emerald, and in one fluid motion, she shattered the gas lamp hanging above the table. The room plunged into a terrifying, pitch-black chaos. Men screamed, tables were overturned, and the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the cellar. In the dark, the sisters moved like ghosts. They knew the layout. They had memorized every step. Alice threw a concentrated vial of phosphorus onto the floor, creating a blinding flash of white light that disoriented the pursuers. They scrambled through a coal chute, their fine gentlemen's clothes tearing and staining with soot. They didn't stop until they reached the freezing air of the street, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering like drums. Clara pulled off her top hat, her golden hair spilling out in the moonlight. She held up the silver key, her fingers trembling with the countdown of the adrenaline. "The risky move, Alice," Clara panted, a dark, triumphant laugh escaping her lips. "We have it. The Duke's secrets are no longer in the bank, they are in our hands." "We have to go," Alice said, looking back at the alley where the Baron's men were emerging. "The Queen of the Den has made her move, but the King is going to want her head." They vanished into the fog, two shadows returning to a world of silk, carrying a key that could unlock the fall of an empire. Potions and poisons. While the rest of the Sterling mansion slept under the heavy, suffocating blanket of Victorian propriety, a single, flickering light burned in the highest reaches of the attic. This was Alice's sanctuary, a world of glass, fire, and forbidden knowledge. To Aunt Mildred, this room was a dusty storage space for broken furniture and moth-eaten gowns. To Alice, it was a laboratory where the boundaries of science and survival blurred into one. Alice stood over a copper spirit lamp, her face illuminated by the eerie blue glow of the flame. She was no longer the vacant girl of the drawing room. Here, she was a master of elements. Her hands, usually encased in delicate lace gloves, were stained with the yellow tinge of nitric acid and the purple residue of crushed belladonna. "Almost there," she whispered, her voice a low hum against the bubbling of a glass retort. "Just one more drop of the distilled mandrake, and the solution will stabilize." She was working on her most dangerous creation yet, the truth serum. After the encounter with the Raven and the intrusion of Julian Vane, the sisters realized that information was their only shield. But men like Vane did not give up their secrets willingly. They needed a way to peel back the layers of a man's mind without drawing a single drop of blood. Alice reached for a tiny glass dropper. Inside was a translucent, emerald-colored liquid, a compound of her own invention that combined the sedative properties of opium with the disinhibiting effects of rare alkaloids. In her father's ledger, she had found the chemical foundations, but she had pushed them further into the realm of the unladylike and the revolutionary. The solution turned from a muddy brown to a clear, shimmering gold. Alice's eyes widened. "It's done, Clara, it's finally." Suddenly, the floorboard behind her groaned. Alice froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Alice, are you still awake?" It was the voice of Martha, the head housemaid. Her footsteps were heavy and rhythmic, getting closer to the attic door with every second. Alice's pulse spiked. If Martha entered now, she would see the glass beakers, the sulfurous smoke, and the illegal chemicals that could land Alice in an asylum or worse. In her haste to hide the apparatus, Alice's elbow brushed against a flask of concentrated ammonia. Crash! The glass shattered against the wooden floor. A cloud of pungent, choking vapor erupted into the small room. The smell was overwhelming, a sharp, stinging scent that tore at the lungs and watered the eyes. "Miss Alice, what was that noise?" Martha's hand was on the doorknob. Alice didn't panic. She moved with the speed of a soldier. She grabbed a heavy, moth-eaten velvet curtain and threw it over the bubbling retort. With her other hand, she snatched a bottle of expensive French perfume from her apron, a gift from Aunt Mildred she had never intended to use, and smashed it directly over the spill. The attic was suddenly filled with the conflicting scents of roses and chemical rot. Alice threw herself onto a pile of old cushions, picking up a dusty book of hymns just as the door creaked open. Martha stepped in, her lantern casting long, distorted shadows. She wrinkled her nose, her face twisting in confusion. "Lord have mercy, Miss Alice. It smells like a perfume factory exploded in here. And what was that crashing sound?" Alice looked up, her eyes red and watery from the ammonia fumes. "Oh, Martha, I am so sorry. I was trying to find a trunk of old dresses and I tripped. I broke my bottle of rose water. The smell is quite powerful, isn't it?" Martha walked further into the room, her lantern light swinging dangerously close to the velvet curtain where the spirit lamp was still burning. "It's enough to give a person a fainting spell. It is. You shouldn't be up here in the dark. Miss Aunt Mildred would have my head if she knew you were wandering the attic at this hour." "I couldn't sleep, Martha," Alice said, her voice perfectly mimicking the frail tone of a Victorian lady. "The tea was too strong. I thought a bit of him reading might calm my nerves." Martha sighed, her suspicions softening into pity. "Poor thing, you've been looking peaky lately. Come now, let's get you back to your bed. I'll clean up this mess in the morning." "No," Alice said, a bit too quickly. "I mean, the spill is quite dangerous for your skin, Martha. Rose water and broken glass, you know. I'll do it myself. I need the penance for being so clumsy." Martha chuckled. "As you wish, miss, but don't stay up much longer. The American gentleman is coming for breakfast, and you'll need your beauty sleep." The maid turned and closed the door. Alice waited until the footsteps faded all the way down to the second floor. She collapsed against the wall, her legs shaking. She pulled back the velvet curtain. The spirit lamp was almost out of oil, the flame flickering a final, defiant blue, but the gold liquid, the truth serum, was safe. Alice picked up the vial, holding it up to the moonlit window. It looked like liquid sunlight, beautiful and deadly. "Science is a cruel mistress, Alice," she whispered to herself, quoting a line from a forbidden text she had read in the dark. "But she is the only one who doesn't lie." She tucked the vial into her secret pocket. The spill had nearly cost her everything, but the prize was worth the risk. Tomorrow, Julian Vane would come for tea, and tomorrow, Alice would see if her potions and poisons were enough to break the man of iron. She blew out the lamp, leaving the attic in darkness. The unladylike experiments were over for the night, but the results were just beginning. A cracked mirror. The silence of the Sterling mansion had become a living thing, a heavy, suffocating beast that sat upon the chests of the two sisters. For weeks, they had lived two lives, and the friction between the silk and the soot was finally starting to generate heat. The proper lady image was no longer a disguise, it was a skin that was being peeled away, inch by agonizing inch. Alice sat before her vanity mirror, staring at her reflection. She didn't recognize the girl looking back. The eyes were too wide, the skin too translucent, and the hands that held the truth serum, were trembling. Suddenly, the heavy oak door to her bedroom flew open. There was no knock, there was no politeness. Aunt Mildred marched in, her face a mask of purple rage and aristocratic horror. In her right hand, she held an object as if it were a poisonous viper. It was a boot. It was heavy, made of rough, masculine leather, and caked in the thick, black, sulphurous mud of the East End. "Alice Elizabeth Sterling." Mildred's voice was a low, terrifying hiss. She threw the boot onto the pristine, white lace coverlet of Alice's bed. The mud smeared across the fabric like a streak of filth on a wedding shroud. "I went looking for your prayer book," Mildred screamed, her composure finally breaking. "I reached under your bed to find where you had tucked it away, and I found this grotesque, stinking piece of laborer's filth. Explain yourself. Why is there a man's boot, a poor man's boot, hidden in the chambers of a Sterling lady?" Alice felt the world tilt. The psychological pressure she had been carrying for months surged into her throat. She looked at the boot, then at her aunt, then at the mirror. It must belong to one of the gardeners, Aunt," Alice stammered, her voice cracking. "Perhaps a stray dog dragged it in, or a servant seeking to play a prank." "Do not lie to me," Mildred slapped the vanity table, making the crystal perfume bottles dance. "I saw you, Alice. I saw the way you looked at Julian Vane yesterday. I see the shadows under your eyes. You are not peaceful. You are rotting. You are behaving like those wraiths in the pamphlets. Are you trying to destroy this family? Are you trying to drag our name through the gutters of Whiteacre? Clara appeared in the doorway, her face deathly pale. She saw the boot. She saw the smear on the bed. She saw the fracture in Alice's mind. "Aunt Mildred, please," Clara said, stepping into the room with the grace of a woman walking toward the gallows. "Alice has been unwell, her nerves are frayed. She found that boot in the alley and thought to give it to the poor. She forgot to dispose of it. It is nothing more than a lapse in judgment." Mildred turned on Clara, her eyes narrow and sharp. "A lapse? No, this is a sickness. You both have been acting as if the rules of this house, the rules of this society, do not apply to you. You think you are clever, you think you can hide behind your fans and your poetry. Mildred stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection looming over Alice's shoulder. Look at yourselves, Mildred commanded. You are sterlings, you are meant to be the reflection of purity. If this scandal leaves this room, you will not just be ruined, you will be erased. I will send you to the asylum in Surrey myself before I let you shame your father's memory. Mildred grabbed Alice by the shoulders, shaking her. Where were you last night? Tell me, who gave you this boot? Were you with a man, a revolutionary, a criminal? Alice looked into the mirror. The pressure reached its breaking point. In her mind, she saw the East End, the blood oath, the laboratory, and the dead eyes of her father. She saw the porcelain facade cracking into 1,000 jagged pieces. I was everywhere, Aunt, Alice suddenly laughed, a high, brittle, manic sound that made Mildred recoil. I was in the mud, I was in the ink, I was in the places where the sun never reaches. You want to know about the proper lady? She died a year ago. She died in the same room where father kept his lies. Alice stood up, her movements jerky and erratic. She picked up a heavy silver hairbrush and swung it with all her might. The vanity mirror shattered. Shards of silvered glass exploded across the room, raining down on the carpet like frozen tears. Alice stood amidst the wreckage, her reflection now 100 different, broken versions of herself. There, Alice whispered, her voice suddenly calm, cold, and terrifying. The mirror is fixed. Now you can see us for what we really are, Aunt. We are broken, we are many, and we are no longer yours to command. Mildred backed away, her hand over her mouth. She looked at the two sisters, one standing tall and defiant, the other surrounded by glass and madness. For the first time, the aunt was afraid of the nieces. I will speak to Mr. Vane, Mildred stammered, her voice trembling. He will know what to do with you. You are possessed. You are lost. Mildred fled the room, the rustle of her silk skirts sounding like a dying gasp. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence after a storm. Clara walked over and took Alice's hands, carefully picking the small shards of glass from her skin. You broke the image, Alice, Clara whispered. I couldn't breathe, Clara, Alice sobbed, her strength finally failing as she collapsed into her sister's arms. The corset, it wasn't just on my waist, it was on my soul. I can't be a lady anymore, I can't. Clara held her tight, her eyes fixed on the mud-stained boot on the bed. The tension had snapped. The secret was out of the box, but as she looked at the shattered mirror, Clara realized something. A cracked mirror is more dangerous than a whole one. It has more edges. It can cut deeper. We don't need to be ladies anymore, Alice, Clara said, her voice turning into a weapon. The facade is gone. Now we show them the blade. They sat in the ruins of their proper life, the mud and the glass their only companions. The psychological war was over. The physical war was about to begin. Betrayal in Saturn. The air in the Sterling mansion had turned thin, as if the very oxygen was being drained by the secrets hidden within its walls. Following the shattering of the mirror, a new ghost haunted the corridors. It was not the ghost of their father, nor the shadow of Julian Vane. It was a betrayal, wrapped in the soft, rustling folds of satin. Clara was in her dressing room, her fingers mindlessly tracing the intricate embroidery of a new gown. Behind her, Sarah, the maid who had served the Sterling sisters since they were children, was pinned to her silhouette, brushing Clara's hair with a rhythmic, hypnotic stroke. Sarah had always been the silent one, the one who knew exactly how they liked their tea, the one who never questioned the mud on their boots or the ink on their fingers. Or so they thought. You've been very quiet lately, Sarah, Clara remarked, her eyes meeting the maid's reflection in a smaller handheld mirror, even for you. The brush stopped. For a heartbeat, the room was so silent that Clara could hear the frantic ticking of the watch at her waist. I have been thinking, Miss Clara, Sarah said. Her voice was no longer the submissive whisper of a servant. It was flat, cold, and dangerously confident. I have been thinking about the blue thistle in the East End, and the printing press in Fleet Street, and that heavy, black ledger you keep hidden in the lining of your cloak. Clara's blood turned to ice. She did not move, she did not gasp. She simply tightened her grip on the silver mirror until her knuckles turned white. "That is a very imaginative list, Sarah," Clara said, her voice a low, warning growl. "A bit too imaginative for a girl who is paid to mend hems and carry trays." "I'm paid for many things, miss," Sarah replied, stepping around to face Clara. She didn't bow, she didn't look down. "Lately, I have been paid very well by the House of Penhaligon. You remember them, don't you? The family your father ruined, the family whose name is written in red ink on page 64 of your secret book." The betrayal hit harder than a physical blow. The Penhaligons were their father's greatest rivals, a family that had been waiting for a single crack in the sterling facade to tear them down. "They know everything, Miss Clara," Sarah continued, a cruel smile touching her lips. "Every midnight carriage, every vial Alice mixes in the attic. I have been their eyes in this house for 6 months. Every scrap of paper you threw in the bin, every coded letter you thought you burned, I saved them all." At that moment, the door clicked shut. Alice stood there, her face a mask of cold, scientific detachment. She had heard everything from the hallway. In her hand, she held a small glass vial filled with a colorless liquid. "So," Alice said, her voice devoid of emotion, "the snake was in the garden all along. We treated you like a sister, Sarah. We gave you gold when your mother was ill. We trusted you with our lives." "Trust is for the rich, Miss Alice," Sarah spat. "The Penhaligons offered me enough to buy a cottage in the country and never see a laundry tub again. Why should I hang with you when I can live comfortably on your ruins?" The atmosphere in the room shifted. The ladies of the house were gone. In their place were 2 desperate women whose survival depended on a single, terrible decision. "Slow down the pace here. What do you want, Sarah?" Clara asked, standing up slowly. She was taller than the maid, and her presence filled the room like a dark cloud. "The ledger," Sarah demanded. "Give me the book, and I'll tell the Penhaligons that I was mistaken. I'll tell them you're just 2 silly, bored girls. If not, the inspector will be here by sunset with a warrant for your execution." Alice looked at Clara. The blood oath they had sworn in the alleyway echoed in their minds. If one is caught, the other must burn the evidence. But Sarah wasn't the law. She was a leak that had to be plugged. "We can't give you the ledger, Sarah," Alice said, walking toward her with the vial, "because the ledger doesn't just contain the Penhaligons' secrets, it contains yours." Sarah frowned. "Mine, I'm a servant. I have no secrets worth a book." "Oh, but you do," Clara intervened, stepping closer, cornering the maid against the wardrobe. "Our father kept records of everyone, including the unfortunate accident involving the Penhaligons' son 3 years ago. You were the maid in their house back then, weren't you? You were the one who forgot to extinguish the lamp in his study." Sarah's face went from triumph to a deathly, chalky white. That was an accident. I didn't mean." "It doesn't matter what you meant," Clara hissed, her face inches from Sarah's. "It matters what is written in the sterling ink. If we go down, we take you with us. You won't be living in a cottage, Sarah. You'll be swinging from the same gallows as we are." The maid began to tremble. The satin ribbons of her apron fluttered with her shaking hands. "The Penhaligons, they won't let you hurt me." "The Penhaligons won't even know you're gone," Alice said, holding up the vial. "This is a concentrated extract of digitalis. It leaves no trace. It looks like a heart failure, just like our father, just like so many unfortunate people in London." Dramatic pause, 1.5 seconds. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a death sentence. The sisters looked at the girl they had once called a friend. They saw the betrayal, but they also saw their own reflection, 2 women who had become as ruthless as the world that tried to crush them. "We have 2 choices, Sarah," Clara said, her voice like a velvet hammer. "Choice 1, you take a suitcase, you take this bag of gold, and you disappear. You board a ship for Australia tonight. You never speak to a Penhaligon again. You vanish from the face of the earth." Sarah looked at the bag of gold Clara pulled from the vanity. "And choice 2, Sarah whispered. Alice stepped forward, the glass vial glinting in the gaslight. "Choice 2 is the satin sleep. You don't leave this room. We tell Aunt Mildred you had a fainting spell. By morning, you are buried in a pauper's grave, and the secrets die with you. Sarah looked at the gold. Then she looked at Alice's cold, steady hand. She realized that the Sterling sisters weren't dolls anymore. They were monsters of their own making. Australia, Sarah sobbed, collapsing to her knees. I'll go to Australia, I swear it, just, please, put the vial away. Clara grabbed the maid by her hair, forcing her to look up. If I hear a whisper, if I see a single Penhaligon agent near this house, I will find you. It doesn't matter if you're across the ocean. I will find you, and I will show you that the Shadow Sisters are very, very real. They didn't let Sarah out of their sight. They watched her pack. They watched her strip off the satin sterling uniform, and in the dead of night, they watched her disappear into the fog, a ghost created by her own greed. As the door closed behind her, Alice turned to Clara. She was still holding the vial. Would you have done it, Clara? Alice asked, her voice small. If she hadn't taken the gold, would we have killed her? Clara looked at her own hands. They were clean, but they felt stained. We are at war, Alice, Clara replied, her voice hollow. In war, there are no maids. There are only soldiers and casualties. We did what we had to do to survive. But as they sat in the quiet dressing room, surrounded by the satin and the lace, the sisters realized the truth. They hadn't just silenced a maid. They had lost a piece of their humanity. The betrayal wasn't just Sarah's, it was their own. They were becoming the very things they fought against. The war for the Sterling name was escalating, and the cost of victory was starting to look a lot like a soul. The inspector's knock. The rain over Belgravia was not the gentle mist of the countryside. It was a rhythmic, drumming assault that matched the pounding of Clara Sterling's heart. They had barely finished erasing the traces of Sarah's betrayal when the sound they had feared most echoed through the marble hallway. Slow, heavy pace, boom, boom, boom. It was not the polite tap of a visiting suitor. It was the heavy, iron-fisted authority of the law. Inspector Reed of Scotland Yard to see the mistresses of the house, the footman announced, his voice trembling with a hint of the scandal that usually followed the inspector like a shadow. Clara looked at Alice. Their transformation was instantaneous. The iron resolve they had shown Sarah was buried beneath layers of fabricated fragility. Clara grabbed a bottle of smelling salts, while Alice pinched her own cheeks until they were a feverish, agitated red. Play the part, Alice, Clara whispered, her voice a ghost of a breath. Today we are not the Shadow Sisters, we are not the benefactors. Today we are nothing more than silly, frightened girls. They entered the drawing room just as Inspector Reed was packing the floor. He was a man built of granite and sharp observations. His coat was damp from the London fog, and his eyes, cold, grey and unyielding, seemed to scan the room for the slightest inconsistency. Inspector, Clara trilled, her voice 2 octaves higher than its natural range. She fluttered her lace handkerchief as if she were a butterfly caught in a storm. To what do we owe this terrifying honor? Surely we haven't violated any carriage laws. Inspector Reed stopped. He didn't bow. He looked at Clara, then at Alice, his gaze lingering on the faint smudge of soot that Alice had missed near her hairline. I'm not here for carriages, Miss Sterling, Reed said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I am here because of the East End Angels. For months, 2 women have been seen providing medicine and, more dangerously, revolutionary pamphlets to the rabble of White-Capel. Last night, they were seen fleeing a masquerade at Vauxhall. A witness, a very reliable witness, said the carriage bore a striking resemblance to one seen leaving this street. Alice let out a small, dramatic gasp, collapsing onto the velvet chaise long as if her bones had turned to water. Revolutionaries, in our house? Oh, Clara, I feel a fainting spell coming on, the very thought of such dirty people. There, Alice, Clara rushed to her side, waving the smelling salts with theatrical franticness. Inspector, you must forgive my sister. Her nerves have been quite delicate since the passing of our dear father. The mention of the East End is enough to send her into hysterics. It's so unrefined. Reed didn't flinch. He walked closer, his boots clicking like a death knell on the hardwood. Unrefined, yes, but effective. These angels are undermining the Duke's authority. They are distributing information that could hang half the House of Lords. Tell me, Miss Sterling, where were you last night between the hours of midnight and 4? Last night, Clara blinked, her eyes wide and vacant. Why, we were right here. We were practicing our duets. Aunt Mildred can attest to it, though she fell asleep during the third sonata. Music is such a wearying pursuit, don't you agree? Reed's eyes narrowed. He reached out and picked up a small silver tray from the side table. On it lay a copy of the Times and a half-finished embroidery hoop. You practice duets in the dark? Reed asked. Because the watchman on this beat says the lights at number 12 were extinguished by 11, and yet, the mud on your front steps this morning didn't come from a Belgravia garden. It's thick, black, and smells of the Thames. The air in the room became brittle. Alice leaned back, her hand over her heart, her eyes fluttering. The mud, oh, the mud. I told the gardener the roses were too damp. Inspector, you simply must speak to him. It is so difficult to find good help these days, is it not? I am not interested in your roses, Miss Alice, Reed snapped, his patience fraying. I am interested in the truth. I have seen the way you look at the American, Julian Vane. You aren't as silly as you pretend. You have the eyes of a woman who reads the ledgers, not the poetry. Clara stood up, her face turning a deep, insulted shade of pink. Inspector, you overstep. To suggest that we, the daughters of Richard Sterling, would associate with the filth of the East End is not just an insult. It is a fantasy. We are ladies. We spend our days at the dressmaker and our evenings at the opera. We don't even know where Whitecapel is. Is that so? Reed reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crushed blue thistle, the same symbol from their apothecary door. Then, perhaps you can explain why this was found snagged on a velvet cloak in a carriage abandoned near the docks. A cloak made of the same expensive silk as the dress you are wearing now. Alice let out a loud, shrill cry, burying her face in her hands. A thistle, a weed. Oh, Clara, the filth is everywhere. I can't bear it. I simply can't bear it. She began to sob, loud, rhythmic, silly sobs that filled the room with noise. Clara turned on Reed, her eyes flashing with a fake, haughty anger. Look at what you've done. You've traumatized a girl of noble birth with your weeds and your talk of docks. Leave this house at once. Unless you have a warrant, I will have our solicitor at Scotland Yard by tea time. Reed stared at them for a long, agonizing minute. He saw the fainting girl and the outraged sister. To any other man, it was a convincing performance of feminine weakness. But Reed was a hunter. He saw the way Clara's hand didn't shake, even as she shouted. He saw that Alice's sobs didn't produce a single real tear. I don't have a warrant yet, Reed said, his voice dropping to a whisper, but I will find one, and when I do, the East End angels will find that the law has a very long memory. Good day, Miss Sterling. I hope your sister recovers. He turned on his heel and marched out. The front door slammed, shaking the windows in their frames. Pause 1.5 seconds. The instant the sound of his carriage hooves faded, the silly girls vanished. Alice sat up straight, her eyes clear and cold. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, all traces of the faint gone. Clara dropped the smelling salts onto the table with a disgusted clatter. He knows, Clara, Alice said, her voice back to its sharp, clinical tone. He has the thistle, he has the mud. The silly girl act won't work a second time. It worked for today, Clara said, her mind already racing toward the next move. But he's right. The law is closing in. We have to accelerate the plan. If Reed gets that warrant, we won't be fainting in drawing rooms. We'll be standing on the gallows. What's next? Clara looked at the silver tray where the thistle had sat. Julian Vane, the American has the papers we need to escape. If we can't hide from the inspector, we have to leave the country before he returns. They stood in the center of the silent mansion, no longer dolls, no longer ladies. They were soldiers who had survived a skirmish, but they knew the war was coming to their very doorstep. The inspector's knock had been a warning. The next sound would be the breaking of the door. Midnight at the docks. The London docks at midnight were a place where the world bled into the blackness of the Thames. There was no gaslight here, only the dull, orange glow of oil lanterns swinging from the masts of ghost ships. The air was a thick, putrid cocktail of rotting fish, raw sewage, and the metallic tang of incoming rain. Clara and Alice moved like twin shadows, their silhouettes blending into the stacks of wooden crates and rusted iron chains. They had received a tip-off, a frantic, anonymous note delivered by a street urchin, stating that the final account of the Sterling estate was being settled tonight at Pier 14. "Stay close, Alice," Clara whispered, her hand gripping the hilt of a small dagger hidden in her sleeve. "The fog is thick, but the men here have eyes like rats. If we are spotted, the river will be our only grave." They reached the edge of a massive, weather-beaten warehouse. Above the door, a faded sign read, "Marlborough Shipping & Co. Slow down for dramatic effect." The Duke, Clara thought, the high-ranking Duke of Marlborough, the man our father called the Golden Lion in his ledger. The sound of heavy, rhythmic thumping echoed from the pier. A group of men, their faces hidden behind rough woolen scarves, were unloading heavy, unmarked crates from a sleek, black-hulled schooner. These were not crates of tea or silk. They were small, reinforced with iron, and handled with a terrifying level of secrecy. "Look at the markings, Clara," Alice whispered, pointing toward a crate that had caught the lantern light. There, branded into the wood, was the Sterling crest, a lion holding a broken key, but beneath it, stamped in fresh, red ink, was the ducal seal of Marlborough. It was the physical proof of a partnership that transcended the grave. Suddenly, a carriage pulled up to the edge of the pier. It was a royal carriage, its polished black panels reflecting the murky water. A man stepped out. He was tall, silver-haired, and moved with an arrogance that only centuries of inherited power could provide. "The Duke of Marlborough himself," Clara breathed, her eyes narrowing. Beside the Duke stood a man they recognized all too well, Baron Mordaunt, the gambler from The Devil's Drop. "Is the shipment complete, Baron?" The Duke's voice rang out, a cold, aristocratic command that cut through the fog. "Every ounce is here, Your Grace," the Baron replied, bowing low. "The Sterling girls have been troublesome, but they have no idea that their father's heart failure was actually a matter of his refusing to sign over the final routes. He grew a conscience in his old age, a fatal mistake." Alice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sound was small, but in the dead silence of the docks, it sounded like a gunshot. Dramatic pause, 1.5 seconds. One of the Duke's guards, a man with a scarred face and a heavy bludgeon, spun around. "Who's there? Show yourself." "Run," Clara hissed. They didn't head for the street, they dove deeper into the labyrinth of the warehouse. Behind them, the calm of the docks exploded into chaos. Whistles blown by the Duke's private guards echoed off the stone walls. "The stairs, Alice, up to the catwalk." They scrambled up a rusted iron ladder, their boots clanging against the metal. From the height of the catwalk, they could see the entire operation. Hundreds of crates, filled with illegal opium and stolen blueprints for British naval engines, were being moved under the protection of the Duke's seal. This was the source of the Sterling fortune. This was the sin that had killed their father. "We have to get the documents, Clara." Alice pointed to a small leather satchel sitting on a desk in the center of the warehouse floor. "The shipment manifests. If we have those, even Inspector Reed can't ignore the Duke's guilt." "It's a suicide mission, Alice. It's our only chance." Alice didn't wait. She used the skills she had learned in the East End, sliding down a heavy transport rope with a speed that defied her proper lady training. She landed softly on the wooden floor, snatched the satchel, and turned to run. "Hold!" It was the Baron. He had spotted her. He pulled a silver-plated pistol from his coat, his eyes gleaming with the madness of a man who was about to lose everything. "The Sterling brat," the Baron sneered, leveling the gun at Alice's heart. "You should have stayed in your drawing room, playing your piano. Now you'll play the harp in hell." Dramatic pause, 1 second. Bang! The gunshot echoed through the warehouse, but Alice didn't fall. From the catwalk above, Clara had thrown a heavy iron pulley, striking the Baron's arm just as he pulled the trigger. The bullet whistled past Alice's ear, shattering a glass lantern behind her. Fire erupted instantly. The oil from the lantern ignited the dry straw on the floor, and within seconds, the warehouse was a furnace of orange flame and black smoke. The Duke and his men scrambled for the exit, prioritizing the shipment over the sisters. "Leave them," the Duke shouted. "The fire will do the hangman's work." Clara leaped from the catwalk, landing hard beside Alice. The heat was blistering, the smoke choking the air from their lungs. "The satchel, did you get it?" Clara coughed, her face streaked with soot. "I have it," Alice said, clutching the leather bag to her chest. "The manifests, the Duke's signature, it's all here." They fought their way through the inferno. The warehouse was collapsing, the heavy timber beams groaning as they succumbed to the fire. They burst through the back service door, tumbling onto the wet cobblestones just as the roof of the warehouse caved in with a deafening roar. They lay there, drenched by the rain, watching the Duke's schooner disappear into the fog of the Thames. "We have the proof, Clara," Alice whispered, her voice ragged. "We have the Duke, we have the truth." "But we have no home left to go to," Clara replied, looking at her burnt sleeves and the blood on her hands. "The climax has begun, Alice. Tonight, the Sterling sisters died in that fire. Tomorrow, the world meets the women who survived." They stood up, two ghosts in the rain, holding the evidence that would destroy the most powerful man in London. The docks were silent again, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the distant, mournful sound of a foghorn. The hunt was over. The war was officially declared. The weight of the veil. The Sterling mansion was draped in a silence so thick it felt like velvet. Following the fire at the docks, the sisters had returned like wraiths, soot-stained, bleeding, and transformed. But to the world, they could not be warriors. They had to be victims. Slow summer pace, the deception began at dawn. Clara had collapsed in the grand foyer, her silk dress torn, her eyes rolling back in a perfectly practiced, hysterical fit. Alice followed suit, locking herself in her chambers and screaming at the walls until her throat was raw. "A nervous breakdown," Aunt Mildred had whispered to the doctor, her voice trembling with shame. "The shock of their father's death, the stress of the season, their fragile feminine minds have simply snapped." Now the house was under a self-imposed quarantine. Thick, black mourning veils were draped over the mirrors, and the curtains were drawn tight against the intrusive London sun. To Aunt Mildred and the prying eyes of Inspector Reed, the sisters were broken. In reality, they were finally free. Clara sat in the center of Alice's room, the heavy black veil still attached to her hair, hanging down like a shroud. She looked like a widow of her own life. "We have 48 hours, Alice," Clara whispered, her voice sharp and focused. "Mildred is too afraid of a public scene to let anyone in. The doctor has prescribed bed rest and laudanum. We have 48 hours to turn these manifests into our ticket out of England." Alice was sitting on the floor, surrounded by maps of the Atlantic and the stolen leather satchel from the docks. She was no longer crying. Her eyes were hard, her fingers steady. "The Duke's men are watching the front gates," Alice said, pointing to a gap in the heavy velvet curtains, "and Inspector Reed is stationed at the corner. They are waiting for the Shadow Sisters to emerge. They don't realize the Shadow Sisters are already here, hiding behind the weight of the veil." The psychological toll was immense. For 48 hours, they had to maintain the charade. Every time a maid brought a tray of broth to the door, Alice had to let out a low, mournful moan. Every time Aunt Mildred knocked, Clara had to speak through the wood in a voice that sounded like it was crumbling into dust. "It's a strange thing, isn't it?" Alice remarked, her voice hollow. "To use their own low opinion of us as our greatest shield. They think we are too weak to survive a nervous shock, so they leave us alone to plan their destruction." "It is the only weapon they haven't taken from us, Alice," Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the Duke's signature on the manifest. "Our perceived weakness is the only place they won't look for our strength." They worked through the first night with the intensity of ghosts. They transcribed the Duke's manifests into 3 separate copies. One was for Julian Vane, their only hope for a passage to New York. One was to be mailed to the Times the moment their ship cleared the harbor. And the third was their insurance. The grandfather clock in the hall was a reminder of their dwindling window. The weight of the veil was becoming literal. The black fabric of their mourning clothes felt like it was absorbing the light and the air. "I feel like I'm already dead, Clara," Alice whispered, leaning her head against the mahogany bedpost. "If we stay in this room any longer, I fear I won't remember how to be a person again. I'll just be a character in a tragedy." Clara walked over and lifted the veil from Alice's face. She looked into her sister's tired, bloodshot eyes. "We aren't dead, Alice. We are in the womb. We are waiting to be born into a world where we don't have to wear masks. Just 24 more hours. Can you hold the veil for 24 more hours?" Alice nodded slowly. "I can hold it, but when we take it off, I want to burn it. I want to burn everything." On the second day, the pressure intensified. Inspector Reed had sent a formal request to interview the sisters regarding the fire. Aunt Mildred had nearly fainted at the door, arguing with the inspector about decorum and the sanctity of a ladies' sick room. Tense, whispered tone, Clara stood behind the bedroom door, listening to Reed's gravelly voice in the hallway. "I only wish to see them, madam," Reed barked, "to ensure they are as unwell as you claim. There are rumors that the Sterling girls were seen near Pier 14. "Preposterous," Mildred's voice rose to a shriek. "They are in mourning, they are prostrate with grief. Have you no heart, Inspector, to disturb two orphans in their darkest hour?" Reed paused. Clara could feel his suspicion through the wood. He was a man who didn't believe in nerves. He believed in footprints and fingerprints. "Very well," Reed muttered, "but tell them this. The veil may hide the face, but it does not hide the truth. I will be back when the 48 hours are up, and I will not be so polite." The footsteps retreated. Clara slumped against the door, her forehead resting on the cool wood. "He's not leaving, Alice. He's waiting for the breakdown to end. He knows we're in here. Then we have to make sure that when he finally enters this room, it's empty," Alice said, standing up and grabbing the final escape map. "The American leaves at dawn. We meet him at the secret cove near Gravesend. No carriages, no veils, just the dark." The final hours were spent in a fever of preparation. They packed nothing but the ledger, the manifests, and their father's hidden gold. They left their silk dresses on the hangers like empty cocoons. They left their embroidery and their poetry books. As the sun began to set on the second day, the weight of the veil was finally lifted. Clara stood by the window, looking out at the London skyline one last time. The fog was rolling in, thick and protective. "Goodbye, Miss Sterling," Clara whispered to her reflection in the cracked mirror. "I won't miss you at all." They moved to the service stairs. Behind them, the nervous breakdown had served its purpose. It had given them the time to die so that they could finally live. The deception was complete. The escape was beginning. A scandal unearthed. The explosion did not come from a bomb. It came from the morning edition of the Daily Chronicle. Fast, energetic pace across the city of London, from the gilded drawing rooms of Mayfair to the damp, rat-infested alleys of the East End, the news spread like a wildfire in a dry forest. The headline was massive, black, and unforgiving: "The Duke's blood money, the Sterling ledger revealed." Clara and Alice sat in a small, nondescript room in a safe house near the Gravesend docks. They had sent the final documents to the press just as the sun broke over the horizon. Now, they watched through the grimy window as the city they had once called home began to tear itself apart. "It's done, Alice," Clara whispered, her voice a mixture of triumph and terror. "The secrets are unearthed. The Duke can no longer hide behind his title. The scandal is so vast, even the Crown cannot silence it." The pamphlets they had printed earlier were now being reprinted by every major newspaper. The details were lurid: illegal opium routes, stolen naval secrets, and the cold-blooded murder of Richard Sterling. The Sterling diamonds were no longer seen as victims. They were now the architects of the greatest social earthquake in Victorian history. But as London society reeled from the shock, the shadows began to move. Slow down for mounting dread. The villains they had exposed were not going to go quietly to the gallows. The Duke of Marlborough had unleashed his hounds, a group of elite, ruthless mercenaries whose only objective was to erase the evidence and the sisters who held it. The sound of heavy boots on the stairs of the safe house made Alice jump. She grabbed her leather satchel, her knuckles white with tension. "They've found us, Clara. The scandal has unearthed the truth, but it has also unearthed our grave." "The back window," Clara commanded, "down the fire escape." They scrambled through the window just as the door to their room was kicked off its hinges. A hail of bullets shattered the glass behind them, raining down shards of light in the grey morning. "Kill them," a voice screamed from inside, a voice that sounded like Baron Mordaunt's ragged snarl. "The Duke wants their heads on a platter." The hunt was no longer a game of shadows. It was a brutal, open-air chase. Clara and Alice ran through the labyrinthine streets of Gravesend, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering like war drums. Behind them, the hounds were closing in. They saw the glint of steel and the cold, professional eyes of men who killed for sport. "This way, toward the shipyard," Clara shouted. They dove into a forest of half-built ships and stacks of seasoned timber. The smell of sawdust and tar was overwhelming. They climbed over rusted anchors and through the skeletons of great wooden vessels. Dramatic pause, 1 second. Suddenly, a man stepped out from behind a pile of iron plating. It was not a mercenary, it was Inspector Reed. He stood there, his grey coat fluttering in the wind, his pistol drawn and aimed directly at Clara's chest. "It ends here, Miss Sterling. You have caused enough chaos to last a century. Hand over the remaining manifests, and perhaps I can protect you from the Duke's men." "Protect us," Clara laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You were the one who helped the Duke hide the opium roots for years, Reed. We saw your name in the ledger, page 89, the silent protector of the docks." Reed's face turned a deathly, bruised purple. His hand tightened on the trigger. "The ledger is a lie, a dead man's fantasy, and dead girls don't tell stories." Before he could fire, a shot rang out from the shadows above. Reed's hat flew off his head as a bullet grazed his temple. "Looking for us, Inspector?" It was Julian Vane. The American stood on the deck of a half-finished schooner, a Winchester rifle in his hands. He looked down at the scene with a cold, predatory smile. "I believe the ladies have an appointment in New York," Vane called out, his voice rich with American arrogance. "And I don't like it when my partners are delayed by the local constabulary." In the confusion, Clara and Alice bolted. They ran past a stunned Reed, dodging the Duke's mercenaries who were now emerging from the fog. Vane provided cover, his rifle barking rhythmically, pinning the villains behind the timber stacks. "To the boat!" Vane yelled, jumping down from the deck. They reached the water's edge, where a small steam launch was waiting, its engine hissing with suppressed power. They scrambled aboard, the metal deck vibrating under their feet. "Go, go, go!" Clara screamed. The launch roared to life, tearing away from the pier just as a group of mercenaries reached the edge. They fired a desperate volley of shots, the bullets splashing harmlessly into the water behind the boat. Clara looked back. She saw Inspector Reed standing on the pier, his face a mask of ruined ambition. She saw the safe house in the distance, the smoke from the scandal still rising over the city. Pause, 1.5 seconds. "We're alive," Alice whispered, collapsing onto the deck, clutching the satchel to her chest. "We're actually alive." "But London is dead to us," Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the open sea met the sky. "The scandal unearthed the world we hated. Now we have to build a new one." The steam launch moved toward the great silhouette of an Atlantic liner waiting in the deep water. Behind them, the bells of London were ringing, a mournful, chaotic sound. The Duke was ruined. The Sterling name was a curse, and the Shadow Sisters were finally, truly free. The revelation was complete. The villains were exposed, and as the ship's foghorn let out a long, triumphant blast, Clara Sterling took off her gloves and threw them into the sea. The porcelain was gone, the silk was gone, there was only the salt, the wind, and the future. The final ballroom waltz. The The Sterling mansion breathed with a false vitality, its lungs filled with the scent of gardenias and the sharp, metallic tang of impending ruin. This was the final ballroom waltz, the last stand of a dynasty that was already burning from within. Despite the scandals rocking the city, Aunt Mildred had insisted on one last grand display of defiance. She wanted the world to see that the Sterlings were still untouchable. She was wrong. Slow, rhythmic pace, the orchestra began a haunting minor-key waltz, the violins weeping as much as they played. Clara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her gown a shimmering masterpiece of silver and black lace. She looked like a queen of the underworld. Beside her, Alice stood in ivory, her face as calm and terrifying as a winter morning. "They are all here, Clara," Alice whispered, her lips barely moving behind a handheld silk fan. "The Duke's spies, the Baron's associates, and there, near the punch bowl, Inspector Reed." "And Julian Vane?" Clara asked, her eyes scanning the crowd. "He is waiting in the library," Alice replied. "He has the papers, but we cannot leave until the clock strikes 12. We must play the part until the very last second." They descended the stairs, their movements synchronized, their porcelain masks perfected one last time. As they hit the ballroom floor, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. The whispers followed them, hissing like serpents in the tall grass. "The Shadow Sisters," one dowager whispered. "The scandal-mongers," hissed a lord. Clara ignored them. She felt a presence behind her, a heavy, suffocating weight. She turned to find Inspector Reed. He wasn't in uniform, he was in formal evening wear, but his eyes were still those of a hangman. "May I have this dance, Miss Sterling?" Reed asked. It wasn't a request, it was an interrogation. Clara took his hand. As they moved into the center of the floor, the waltz began. Dramatic pause, 1 second. "You are very brave to host a ball while the city calls for your arrest," Reed said, his hand gripping hers with a bruising strength. "The Duke is in a rage, Clara. He wants the manifests, he wants the ledger, and he wants you silenced." "The Duke is a relic of a dying age, Inspector," Clara countered, her feet moving in perfect time with the music. "And you are a man who has hitched his wagon to a falling star. Tell me, how does it feel to know that your badge is now worth less than the ink on my pamphlets?" Reed leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "I have a warrant in my pocket, Clara. It's signed by a judge who still fears the Duke. The moment this waltz ends, the silly girls go to Newgate." "Then you'd better make this waltz last forever, Inspector," Clara smiled, a cold, jagged expression. "Because the moment it ends, you lose everything." Across the room, Alice was being led through the dance by Julian Vane. He looked out of place in the Victorian ballroom, his movements too large, his energy too raw. "The boat is waiting at the secret jetty," Vane whispered as he swung Alice around a pillar. "But Reed has the house surrounded. He's not going to let you walk out the front door." "We aren't leaving through the front door, Julian," Alice replied, her eyes darting to the grandfather clock. "We're leaving through the mirror." Tense, faster pace, the music reached a crescendo. The silent battle of wits was nearing its breaking point. Clara could feel Reed's eyes scanning her for a hidden weapon, while Alice felt Vane's hand hovering near the pistol in his coat. Suddenly, the clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. With every chime, the tension in the room thickened. The guests stopped dancing. The Duke's men moved toward the exits. Reed reached into his coat for the warrant. "It's over, Clara," Reed shouted over the music. "Arrest them." But as the 12th chime echoed through the hall, the lights didn't just flicker, they died. Alice had triggered the chemical fuse she had spent the afternoon preparing in the basement. A thick, sweet-smelling fog erupted from the floor vents, the same smoke she had used in the gambling den. The ballroom was plunged into a terrifying, blinding white haze. Screams of confusion broke the silence. "Clara, Alice," Reed's voice roared through the fog. "You can't hide, I know where you are." He lunged toward where Clara had been standing, but his hands found only empty air and the rustle of a discarded silk veil. In the darkness, the sisters moved with the grace of ghosts. They didn't head for the library, they headed for the grand portrait of their mother. Clara hit the secret latch. The walls swung open. "The American, where is he?" Alice gasped, her lungs burning from the chemical smoke. "Right here, ladies," Vane's voice emerged from the gloom. He grabbed their hands, leading them into the secret passage that ran through the heart of the mansion. Behind them, they could hear Reed pounding on the walls, his screams of fury echoing through the vents. They could hear the Duke's men smashing the furniture, desperate to find the girls who had humiliated them. "The last stand is over," Clara whispered as they reached the end of the tunnel. They emerged into the damp, cold air of the back garden. The mansion behind them was a glowing lantern of smoke and chaos. The final ballroom waltz had ended not with a curtsy, but with a vanishing act. "To the jetty," Vane commanded. They ran through the wet grass, their expensive gowns tearing on the thorns, their jewelry falling into the mud. They didn't look back at the lights of Belgrave Square. They didn't look back at the life they had been born into. As they boarded the small rowing boat that would take them to the Atlantic liner, Clara looked at the silver and black lace of her dress. It was ruined, stained with soot and salt water. "The porcelain is broken, Alice," Clara said, her voice finally finding its true strength. "Let it stay broken," Alice replied, clutching the ledger to her chest. "I prefer the steel." The boat pushed off into the dark, silent waters of the Thames. Behind them, the sterling name was being erased by the fog. Ahead of them, the ocean was waiting. The dance was over. The war was won. Beyond the Atlantic. The Thames was a serpent of liquid coal, twisting through the belly of a city that was trying to swallow them whole. Behind them, the lights of London were fading into a smear of orange and grey. The grand houses of Belgravia, the soot-stained alleys of the East End, and the iron gates of Newgate Prison were all receding into the fog. Slow, heavy pace, Clara and Alice Sterling sat in the back of a small, rhythmic rowing boat. They were no longer the Sterling diamonds. They were ghosts, wrapped in stolen woolen cloaks, their faces hidden beneath the deep hoods of commoners. In Clara's lap sat the iron box, heavy with the gold their father had hidden for a rainy day. But tonight, it wasn't raining, it was pouring secrets. "Do not look back, Alice," Clara whispered, her voice barely a thread against the lapping of the water. "If you look back, the city will find a way to pull you back in. Look only at the horizon." They reached the massive, hulking silhouette of the SS Adriatic, a steamship that looked like a floating iron mountain. It was a beast of the new age, breathing black smoke into the moonlight and vibrating with the power of 1,000 horses. "Names?" the purser asked as they reached the gangplank. He was a tired man with a clipboard, uninterested in the stories of the thousands of souls fleeing the old world. "Mrs. Catherine and Miss Mary Sullivan," Clara said, her voice steady, devoid of its upper-class lilt. "Widows from Ireland, seeking work in the textile mills." The purser didn't even look up. He took the gold coin Clara offered, marked their names, and waved them toward the lower decks. "Pause 1 second. The transition from the master chambers of London to a second-class cabin on a steamship was a brutal awakening. The cabin was a tiny wooden box, smelling of salt water, grease, and the communal anxiety of 100 other passengers. There was no silk, there was no lace. There was only the low, constant thrum of the engine, a heartbeat that felt like it was inside their own chests. "We are moving," Alice whispered as the floor beneath them tilted. They scrambled to the small, salt-encrusted porthole. The pier was moving away. They saw the silhouettes of the dock guards, saw the distant flicker of Inspector Reed's lantern as he realized the birds had flown the coop. But it was too late. The Adriatic let out a roar from its steam whistle, a sound so loud it shook the very marrow in their bones. Dramatic pause, 1.5 seconds. As the ship cleared the mouth of the Thames and hit the open waters of the English Channel, the reality of their escape finally sank in. The porcelain facade had not just been cracked, it had been pulverized. For the first 3 days, the Atlantic was a cruel master. The ship tossed and turned in the autumn swells, the iron hull groaning as if it were in pain. Alice spent the hours huddled in her bunk, her mind a kaleidoscope of memories, the smell of her laboratory, the look on the Baron's face, the weight of the silver hairbrush as she smashed the mirror. "I feel as though I'm being unmade, Clara," Alice said, her voice thin and raspy. "Everything I was taught to be, the etiquette, the needlework, the silence, it's all being washed away by the salt." Clara sat on the floor, counting the gold coins and checking the hidden compartments of the ledger. She looked at her sister, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. "Good," Clara replied. "Let it be washed away. A lady is a creature of the land, Alice. A lady is a decoration, but a survivor is a creature of the sea. We are being unmade so that we can be built stronger. In New York, no one cares if you can play a waltz. They care if you can stand your ground." On the fifth day, the storm broke. The grey curtains of the sky parted to reveal a blue so vast it felt like a physical weight. Clara and Alice climbed to the upper deck, standing near the bow where the spray hit their faces like shards of diamonds. They saw Julian Vane standing near the railing. He had traded his London silk for a rugged leather coat. He looked at the sisters, not as suitors or investors, but as equals in a dangerous game. "You've got the ledger safe?" Vane asked, his voice lost in the wind. "It hasn't left my side," Clara said, patting the satchel beneath her cloak. "The Duke's agents will be waiting in New York, you know," Vane warned, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "They have telegraphs now. The news of the scandal has probably beaten us across the ocean. You aren't going to a sanctuary, you're going to a new battlefield." "Then we'll fight in the new world just as we did in the old," Alice intervened, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "But this time, we won't be fighting from the shadows. We have the gold, we have the evidence, and most importantly, we have ourselves." Slow down the pace, the Adriatic pushed further into the west. Behind them, the sun set over the ruins of their Victorian lives. The weight of the veil was gone. The sisters in silence were finally finding their voices. As the coastline of the New World began to appear, a jagged line of promise and peril, Clara took the iron box and threw the key into the sea. "Why did you do that?" Alice asked. "Because we don't need a key to open the past anymore, Alice," Clara replied. "The past is a sunken ship. We are the ones who made it to the shore." The ship's horn let out a final, triumphant blast as the Statue of Liberty began to emerge from the morning mist. She stood there, iron and proud, a woman holding a torch in a world of men. "Look, Alice," Clara whispered, pointing toward the torch. "She isn't fainting, she isn't hiding, she's lighting the way." They stood at the railing, two women with assumed names and authentic souls. The escape was over, the arrival was beginning. Beyond the Atlantic, a new life was waiting, a life that would be written not in ink and scandal, but in freedom and fire. Legacy of the Unseen. New York City, 1895. The skyline of Manhattan was a jagged silhouette of ambition, a forest of steel and stone that reached for the heavens with a hunger London had never known. The air here did not smell of coal soot and old secrets. It smelled of salt spray, roasted coffee, and the electric hum of a future that refused to wait. Slow, dignified pace, in a sleek, mahogany-paneled office overlooking the Hudson River, a woman stood by the window. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal wool, a garment that allowed for movement, breath, and authority. Her hair, once styled into rigid Victorian coils, was now pulled back in a practical, elegant knot. This was Clara Sterling, though the world now knew her as C.S. Sullivan, the founding partner of Sullivan & Co. Global Exports. Across the room, seated at a desk covered in chemical blueprints and medical journals, was Alice. She was no longer the vacant niece. She was Dr. Alice Sullivan, the head of a research laboratory that provided affordable medicine to the immigrant families of the Lower East Side. "The morning cables have arrived, Clara," Alice said, her voice steady and rich with the confidence of a woman who owned her own destiny. "Anything from the docks?" Clara asked, turning from the window. "The shipment from India has cleared customs, and Julian Vane sent a telegram from Chicago. He says the railroad expansion is complete." They shared a silent smile. Julian had remained their ally, a man who had learned that the Sterling sisters were not business prospects, but a force of nature. Suddenly, a young clerk entered the room, carrying a silver tray. On it lay a single, battered letter. It was covered in various stamps and postmarks, having traveled across the Atlantic and through half a dozen sorting offices. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the elegant, sharp copperplate of Inspector Reed. Dramatic pause, 1.5 seconds. Clara took the letter. Her fingers didn't tremble. She sat down beside Alice, and together they broke the seal. It was dated 6 months prior. To the Sullivan sisters, or the ghosts I once hunted, I am writing this from a small cottage in the countryside, far from the bells of Scotland Yard. My career ended the night the Stirling mansion burned, or rather, the night I realized that the truth is a fire no man can extinguish. The Duke is dead, his reputation a blackened ruin in the history books. Baron Mordaunt died in a gutter in Soho, clutching a silver key that opened nothing. London still speaks of you. In the East End, the children still talk of the Shadow Sisters who brought medicine in the dark. In the West End, the elite still whisper your names in fear, checking their own ledgers for the rot you exposed. You are a legend of the unseen, a myth that keeps the powerful from sleeping too soundly. You were the only ones I couldn't catch, and for that, I am finally at peace. The Victorian lives you left behind are buried in the soot, but the women you became, they are the only truth I have left. Yours in silence, Reed. Slow down the pace for the finale. Alice looked up, a single tear tracing a path through the faint lines of time on her face. He knew, Clara, he knew we were the ones who won. He knew that the Shadow Sisters didn't need a mansion or a title to rule London, Clara replied, folding the letter and placing it into the iron box, which now sat on her desk, open and empty. We ruled through the truth, and the truth is the only legacy that survives the fire. They walked out onto the balcony of their office. Below them, the streets of New York were a sea of people, men and women from 100 different lands, all seeking the same freedom the sisters had fought for. The Stirling name was dead. The porcelain dolls had been shattered, but as the sun set over the Hudson, casting a golden glow over the sisters, they realized the final truth of their journey. They had started as two sisters hiding in the shadows of a man's world. They had ended as the architects of their own universe. What now, Clara? Alice asked, looking out at the endless horizon. Clara took Alice's hand, their blood oath now a distant, sacred memory. Now, Alice, we stop looking for the shadows. We have spent our lives in the dark so that others could see the light. Now we simply live. The legacy of the unseen was complete. The Victorian sisters had died, but the women of the future were just beginning to breathe. The masks were gone, the silence was broken, and as the stars began to appear over the new world, the Stirling sisters finally, truly walked into the sun.